I thought I'd grown accustomed to rough landings. 7 months ago I'd forced myself through a baptism of fire with my first intentional return from outside. Only minutes after I'd accepted self-implementing hyperdimensional mathematics I'd rescued Evelyn from her ill-considered trip and I'd had to complete the equation with her clinging to me for dear life. Since then I had become intimately familiar with the pain and the nausea and the disorientation that came with each slip, with each crash through the membrane, each shunt to outside, each stomach-churning drop through the hidden trapdoor in reality stage. But our arrival on the book-strewn floor of the library canyon was so bad that I ought to have invented a new classification. A Category 6 hurricane of mess, panic, confusion, and pain. Technically we didn't cross the membrane. We didn't so much as brush against it. The equation I'd crafted was like a gravity well slingshot, balling us up in a package of mathematics and swinging us around the fulcrum of the quiet plane, without ever touching down. I had aimed us back toward the library of Carcosa, straight at the memory Saldes had slapped into my brain. Under pressure, I'd taught myself how to teleport. As the saying goes, necessity is the mother of invention, but I've come to believe that a good dash of fear can sometimes help things along. Unfortunately, the source of that motivation had hitched a ride. Hastur had come with us. We crashed down like a starship breaking apart under atmospheric stress, onto the polished wooden floor, tumbling among the book drifts at the bottom of the library canyon myself, Saldes in her sphere shell, Lazzie's forest pattern knight, and our unwanted, uninvited, insistent stowaway. For several vital seconds, all was blood and pain and noise. My head throbbed like a struck gong and my vision blurred with hypotension and stabs of white-hot agony, turning the heaps and hills of discarded books on the library floor into a shadow puppet play of whirling darkness and clawing gloom. My feet slipped on loose tomes, I let go of Saldes' sphere, and doubled up to spit stringy bile onto the floor. Without my tentacles braced against the ground, would have crumpled and fallen on my face. My heart slammed into my ribs like a dying bird and my body dumped another round of adrenaline into my bloodstream, because I knew we weren't out of the woods yet. The knight had let go of me, he couldn't spare a hand to help me up, the most awful, wet, slick, sulphurous sounds were slapping against his armor. Then a heavy swish made me flinch, his axe parting the air followed by a noise like rotten meat exploding under pressure. I couldn't afford to pass out or lie down. I couldn't even afford 5 seconds bent double with my hands on my knees. With effort I hadn't thought myself capable of, I reeled upright, arms clutched around my own chest as if to keep my organs inside, tentacles flailing to catch myself. My blurred vision took in everything at once, the gloomy glow of distant witchlight over the head-height drifts of discarded and ruined books, more tomes slipping and sliding underfoot, Saldes' gray sphere machine, still closed up tight and rolling to bump against a bookdrift not flowing on its strange mechanical blocks, but actually rolling, as if inert and abandoned, as if the slip had knocked her unconscious and insensible. I think I screamed her name for help, but I may as well have screamed at a ball of concrete. On my other side, the forest knight was doing battle with Hastur, whatever Hastur was. By either a miracle of luck or a limitation of the hyperdimensional equation, I had not dragged the entire ring of expanding yellow flesh along behind us. Only 2 of the parasitist librarian corpses had made the transition. They lay in a rapidly yellowing heap on the side of a book drift about 7 feet away from the knight, their dead bodies at the core of a seed bed, a thick layer of soupy flesh like rotting mustard, about the size of a small car, from which emerged a whirling mass of pus-colored tentacles. That bed of yellow flesh had been neatly severed by 2 curved arcs, bisected by the edges of my hyperdimensional teleport. A steaming mess of fluids and tissues and vaguely organ-shaped wet masses were spilling out onto the library floor from those massive wounds, the color of rotten lemons. It reminded me of a slice of lasagna, or one of those terrible microwave pastries that Rain sometimes ate, with the filling overflowing from the sides. The comparison turned my stomach. The internal goop was staining and ruining the books even as the substance rapidly hardened and began to sprout the stubs of fresh tentacles, like a self-cauterizing sample of giant carrion mollusk. Each live tentacle was smooth and thickly muscled, the color of old bone and rancid butter. Trying to focus on them made my eyes ache. They seemed to exist in more than the physical dimension, leaving behind after images and ghostly outlines as they lashed and whipped at the air, as if each tentacle was the sum of all the different positions it might occupy in space. They trailed visible spores of twinkling gold and little clouds of fungal gas. The air was beginning to stink of sulfur again. The knight had severed 2 tentacles with his war axe. Their shriveling remains lay at his feet, twisting and shrinking and smoking. But that was all he'd managed. Several tentacles clutched hard around the head and haft of his axe, trying to rip it from his grip. As I gaped in wordless panic, another 3 tentacles shot out like attacks from a hunting squid. 2 of them bounced off the knight's armor with the ring of starsteel plate, turned away by some outsider property that Lozzie had woven into the metal. But the third struck true, found purchase on the knight's helmet, and began to squeeze. Loops of tentacle dropped around his chest plate and abdomen too, exploiting the opening. I heard metal creak and groan under sudden pressure. The knight tried to pull back, to free his axe and to protect me from a pair of tentacles sneaking around his side, but Haster's hands were much stronger than their slender appearance suggested. To my horror, hairline cracks began to open between the plates of the knight's armor, separating under the massive external pressure. The flesh blob of ascended pneumosomatic Kami inside was losing the tug of war. The king in yellow would not be denied by strength, not here, not clothed in this mask. Haster may not have understood the lack of a skull to crush inside that helmet, the lack of ribcage to shatter and heart to shred, but once the armor was breached, my wonderful little protector would be exposed, not only to the king's wrath, but to the yellow spores in the air, the rotten lemon virions, the fungus and sulfur stench. Saldes had her shell and I had my bioreactor, but the knight, the true knight inside the armor, a scrap of flesh and faith that I personally owed, did not possess those advantages. I hadn't realized, earlier that day, back in the quiet plain, just how vulnerable and soft the knights had chosen to be, by becoming flesh. They had agreed in some Lozzie-dreamt ritual to risk themselves for a greater principle. And the forest knight, right then, was about to die for that principle. For me. With an instinctive flick, more thought than muscle, I slammed all the remaining biochemical control rods out of my trilobe reactor. A gasp ripped from my throat as pure energy flooded my veins, sluiced through my heart, and soaked my brain until I was quivering from head to toe. It felt like how I imagined taking a huge snort of cocaine might feel. Sharp and aware and running red hot, I moved. 2 of my tentacles slipped my squid skull helmet back over my face, though my nose was running freely with blood. On shaking legs I threw myself out from behind the knight, out into the open, arms and tentacles spread wide, teeth gritted and bared and eyes bulging with more than just adrenaline. "Get off him!" I shouted. Well, I tried to shout that. I actually just hissed at the top of my lungs, a long, warbling sound that should not have come from any human throat. To my surprise and horrified dismay, the writhing mass of yellow tentacles, the outsider fungal parasite, Haster, whatever it was, obeyed. In a flash of motion the tentacles were off the knight and into the air, so fast that the poor forest knight stumbled, metal boots clanking against the floorboard and slipping in the discarded books. The whipping, slopping, dripping fronds of yellow death turned to point at me instead. I hissed again, intentionally this time, long and loud, though muffled by the library's enforced quiet. Arms wide, tentacles splayed, making myself look big. I shook from scalp to toes with adrenaline and fear and substances that had no place in a proper human bloodstream. Haster was most certainly not intimidated. The writhing array of yellow tentacles bobbed to the left, then to the right, always pointing at me, as if each one were tipped by an eyeball. The seed bed at their conjoined roots continued to expand, like slime mold crossed with comedy foam, flowing over the books and dissolving their pages, soaking into the floorboards, sprouting little wriggling nubs of new tentacles. My face and hands itched as the air was flooded with fungal stink, my throat began to burn and sweat broke out all over my skin as my body fought off the unseen pathogen. Lozzie's forest knight hefted his axe and took 2 steps sideways, to stand at my shoulder. A right-hand man. But I was in charge now. I hiccuped, loudly. The yellow tentacles flinched. Saw these? I hissed through my teeth, unwilling to take my eyes off the tentacles. They were locked onto me, mesmerized and awaiting a signal, like a snake pit full of charmed cobras. Saldies, wake up, please. What do I do? Saldi's sphere machine lay inert. A mad notion entered my mind, but it made sense. This was no tentacle beast, no animal, no cosmic child. This was a tiny piece of a being similar to the eye. It was the king in yellow, no matter how convincingly masked or how little I had severed from the greater mass. This was a monarch. Slowly, shaking and caked in sweat, I lowered my tentacles and my arms. I pinched the hem of my pink hoodie between thumb and forefinger, bowed my head, bent my knees, and did the best approximation I could of a curtsy. I request an audience with the king in yellow, I croaked out through blood-splattered lips. Bye-bye the gift your daughter has given to me. I tilted one shoulder forward, trying to show the skin-warm, sun-yellow cloak which I still couldn't touch. I claim no position or right by this, I babbled, making it up as I went along. Thank goodness for reading enough trashy fantasy in my teenage years to just spout this off the top of my head. I only ask to be allowed to approach your majesty and speak a few words. If we gave offense or incited alarm, I apologize with all my heart and beg forgiveness, for the sake of your daughter, 7 shades of sunlight. I swallowed another hiccup and raised my eyes. The tentacles were holding still in the air, pointed at me like a clutch of curious serpents trying to hypnotize a mouse, dripping thick yellow globs of venom and fungal matter that dissipated into wisps of toxic yellow gas before they hit the floor, filling the air with stinging fumes which made my eyes water. Please. I added. Hastur waited, but I had nothing more to say. Oh, fine. I spat, another hiss rising in my throat. I braced for impact, whirled my tentacles in a protective wall, and began the difficult, painful work of flushing my skin with neurotoxin and poison and antimycotic agents, a hyperdimensional equation brewing in the back of my mind. If that's not good enough for you, then you're a terrible father to 7s. Stand aside or fight me. You might win, but I'll burn going down and ruin your digestive tract on the way out. And with that, the dripping yellow mass collapsed. The pustulant tentacles shriveled up in the blink of an eye, turning brown and wrinkled like dead fruit, slumping to the floor. The sudden rot carried back down their trunks and into the thick mat of muscular yellow meat, which shrank and dried and went gray in seconds. Its corners peeled up from the books like a salted slug. A faint wisp of clean white steam rose and vanished into the dark library air. The invasive fungal scent ebbed away to nothing, my face and hands and throat stopped itching and my fever broke. In seconds, Hastur was gone, replaced with a gray mass of spent ash and desiccated flesh, with a pair of skeletal librarian corpses lying at its core. Silence returned to the library, broken by the racing of my own heart. Okay. I managed, croaking and coughing, my body still wired tight, ready for fight or flight. I hadn't expected my little outburst to work, and I couldn't believe my eyes as I stared at the dried gray mess on the floor. My hands were shaking with uncontrollable nervous energy, my tentacles were bunched like fists, and I couldn't stop heaving for breath. My vision began to blur and warp at the edges and a strange detachment crept up from the black pool of my subconscious. All dressed up with nowhere to go. With the delicate care of a lover attending to one's own body, I slid the biochemical control rods back into my trilobe reactor, narrowly avoiding the start of burnout. It was like clenching and relaxing muscles inside one's own abdomen in a specific sequence. I felt the power inside me spike, which tore a gasp and a twitch and quiver from me, my knees buckling. But then I slammed all except 3 of the control rods home, letting out an involuntary keening noise through my teeth, a panting wail. For a long moment I just hunched up, sweating and shaking, guarded by the forest night, hugging myself through the strange afterglow. Eventually I felt coherent enough to straighten up again, though I was still panting softly inside the squid mask. I took that off again so I could wipe the sweat and blood off my face with both hands, then wiped those on my sleeves, despairing for the state of my once beautiful pink hoodie. You don't suppose he liked my defiance? I asked the knight in a dry croak, waving a tentacle at Hastur's vacated manifestation. Earned his respect. The knight did not answer. He just shouldered his axe. I took a deep breath, stuck my tongue out at the taste of blood and bile in my throat, despairing at the lack of water to wash it away, then made sure my legs worked before I went to see if Saldis had finished her nap. Her sphere machine lay where it had rolled, leaning against a book drift. Previously, each individual gray block which formed the exterior of the sphere had always been vertical, no matter how far or fast the machine had rolled, or what Saldis had been up to on the inside. But now the blocks were all at an angle, like a capsized ship. Saldis? I said out loud. Oh, come on, I'm too tired for this. Wake up. I slapped the machine with a tentacle. Nothing happened, so I hit it harder, like hammering on a door. The slip better not have killed you, I muttered. And you better not be playing dead. Despite my flippant words, a seed of doubt germinated in my belly. What if I had killed Saldis by accident? I had no particular love for her, but she wasn't my enemy. Such a senseless death would be a tragedy, my fault, a terrible thing to have done. And I would be without a guide again. Come on, little Miss Snail, get up. An idea struck me. What if she was less snail and more tortoise? I readied 3 tentacles and tried to heave her machine off the book drift, planting both feet and putting my back into the motion, but the thing weighed a ton. I lacked the strength to roll it upright. The forest knight joined me a heartbeat later, free hand on the gray blocks. Between us we righted the machine. As soon as the blocks were vertical to the floor, the sphere suddenly stopped and became oddly weightless, lost all inertia but gained infinite stability. Still heaving with all my strength, I blundered into the side and only narrowly avoided cracking my skull open on one of the edges, cushioned by a tentacle. Before I had even taken a breath and stepped back, the front of the sphere snapped open in fast forward, peeling back like the lips of a snarling animal. Saldis emerged in a blur, her red and gold dress like a bleeding, jeweled tongue lashing out from the core of her machine. She planted one bare foot on the lip of the opening, the other back in her pilot's seat, eyes blazing, braids swept back, and held both hands aloft with her soft sleeves fallen back to her elbows. Exactly the sort of pose I would imagine for a wizard in a silly fantasy novel, ready to cast a fireball at her foes if it wasn't for all the blood. Her hands and forearms were split open in twin twisting spirals of exposed muscle and bone flowing like wax, her flesh itself forming a sigil ready to rend the surface of reality. The effect made my eyes hurt and sent a spike of pain directly into the center of my head. Ah, ow, I hissed, stumbling back. Fessie Dotter Nordursens mun ekki finnast vant. She was howling like a banshee. Ekki af ninem goody. Oh, she suddenly cut off. Oh my. Oh dear. She cleared her throat. Have I missed it? I've missed the entire thing. No. Could you put those away, please? I said, still squinting and shielding my eyes from her blood magic. What? What? Put what away? Oh. Saldis gave an awkward little laugh. I heard a sound like a dozen zippers being fastened at once, if zippers were made of meat and bone. When I looked up again, Saldis was still standing with one foot planted on the lip of her sphere machine, staring down at the gray, shriveled mass of Hastur's manifestation with a bewildered frown on her delicate features. And I was all ready for it, too, she murmured, shaking her head. Are you Saldis, are you all right? Pardon, Poppet. She blinked at me with a look like a woken sleepwalker. Oh, yes, quite all right. All together and in one piece, that's what really matters, in the end. In the end, there is no end. Ha ha for me. She nodded at the dead thing on the floor. Looks like a very old, very dried out turd, doesn't it? How undignified. I suppose your traveling without moving trick didn't bring along enough of him to keep him viable, yes? Oh, no. He was here, very much so. He left of his own volition, though. Saldes coughed out a single laugh and then gave a deflating sigh, sagging against her sphere machine. A surprise crested her delicate features and coffee-brown cheeks, a genuinely warm smile. I hadn't seen that kind of smile on her face before, resigned and happy at the same time, more human than I had expected from her. Well, she said. We should count ourselves extremely lucky indeed. And here I was ready to go out in a blaze of glory. Die taking a chunk out of that fellow and I'd get a seat at the head table, alongside Odin himself. In Valhalla? I thought you didn't believe in any gods. There are no atheists in foxholes, my puppet. A frown marred her smile, but then she dismissed it with a shrug. No, I will give that phrase a passing grade. It's presumptuous but grammatically elegant, although foxhole. I would have words with the inventor of that one. Saldes plucked one of the pendants from around her neck, an inverted golden hammer, then raised it to her lips and kissed it with savage relish. She nodded at the ashen gray remains again. Lucky that your strange technique didn't leave enough of him for a fight then, Oh, he tried to fight. Saldes blinked at me several times. Oh no, you must be mistaken. No. I'm not. You're not. Saldes' eyes widened. I shrugged, too exhausted for her awe. I curtsied and asked for mercy. Oh. Saldes brightened. That makes so much more sense. But he didn't respond, so I trash-talked him. Trash-talked? I told him to go away or fight me properly. And that I'd give him indigestion if he ate me. So he left. Saldes stared at me for another heartbeat, mouth open, then started laughing. She laughed long and low and so hard that she cried. She leaned her head against the exterior of her machine and shook all over. I rolled my eyes and clutched at myself, beyond done with this. Saldes. I weep. Saldes reared back up to her full height, one arm thrown wide. Not only for your audacity, but also for the fact that I missed it. She wiped tears from her cheeks, then grabbed one of the golden pendants around her neck. With a quick tug she pulled the necklace free and then tossed it in my direction, a flash of bright gold arcing through the air. I instinctively reached for it with my actual hands, not my tentacles, but fumbled the catch and almost dropped it onto the library floor, slipping on the footing of loose books. TCH. I hissed, frustrated and embarrassed. If it weren't for my tentacles, I would have gone sprawling onto my backside. Oh, Lady Morel, you are such a fascinating creature, Saldes said as I was recovering, huffing and puffing and red in the face. Look at that, you can barely keep your own feet, yet you face down a destroyer of worlds with nothing but polite insults. Perhaps it's your English, perhaps the language is simply that toxic. I gave her an exhausted look, then examined the pendant she'd tossed to me. It was a thick disc about half the size of my palm, showing an intricately detailed design of a stylized, androgynous face. One eye was an empty, blind socket, the other eye was wide open, blazing with inner light. The necklace portion was made of soft dark leather, but the pendant itself must have been worth a fortune. Real gold, yellow and bright and heavy. I can't. You have earned the right, Lady Morel, Saldes said, with a strange new tone I'd never heard in her voice before, softly reverent. Keep it. For what little protection it may offer. Saldes, where I come from, this would be worth a staggering amount of money. I can't just take this. Saldes sneered not at me, but at a formless notion. Money cannot buy wisdom. Only sacrifice does that. Sell it, give it away, or lose it, and you will find it quickly returned to your hands. I frowned at the pendant, then sighed. All right, thank you. Thank you for the gift. As long as this isn't another hidden marriage proposal, or any other kind of hidden proposal. Yes. Saldes tutate. Perish the thought. I would never get in the way of a pretender's romance, I'm not suicidal. Besides, Lady Morel, you are cute as a fawn, but you are not my sort. Well, I cleared my throat, vaguely embarrassed. Good to know. I tucked the pendant away inside the front pocket of my hoodie, out of sight and out of mind, and finally raised my eyes beyond this little clearing between the drifts of discarded books. We were quite close to one towering wall of the library canyon, perhaps only 100 feet away. The sheer wooden wall rose for 60 feet or more, cloaked in thick shadows and cobwebbed with climbing staircases, before giving way to the first of the library floors. A few clutches of squid-faced librarians peered over the railings up above, but with only their own customary curiosity, not piloted by an outsider god-parasite. Some of them clutched books, others held those wicked fork weapons for controlling intruders, but none of them moved toward the staircases. None of this matched the memory Saldes had slapped into me, but that memory was already fading into a dreamlike haze. All I could picture was a wooden archway. I don't see anything that looks like a front entrance, I said. Are we in the right place? Exactly the right place, Saldes answered, airy and arrogant. She slapped the side of her machine and then slipped back down into her pilot's seat, putting her feet up on the open lip. Her two rats appeared from somewhere behind the seat, scrabbling up into her lap and nuzzling at her hands. And how is that memory I shared with you, Lady Morel? She asked the question without looking up from her rats. How is it faring? Mostly faded by now, actually. Good, she announced. Good, yes. As it should be. I shall lead the way, have no fear. Saldes' gray sphere machine turned on the spot and trundled out of the little cove of book drifts, the blocks ticking against the exposed floorboards where they weren't cushioned by fallen tomes and loose pages. I shared a wary look with the forest knight, or at least imagined that he looked back at me with the same level of doubt and trepidation, despite his blank, unseeing helmet. Then drew myself up as best I could, gathered my tentacles close to my core, and set off after Saldes. We didn't travel far before the front entrance revealed itself. Saldes rounded the corner of the book drifts and led us toward the library floors, out into a wide open space that was somewhat clearer compared to the hills of books toward the center of the canyon. Perhaps the librarians stuck close to the walls whenever their cataloging duties sent them down here. There, see? Saldes said when we were perhaps 200 meters out from the canyon wall. Precisely the right place. Just as I remember it. As we approached, the front entrance drifted out of the gloom. What had seemed a blank space, hidden deep in the shadows, resolved first into a stretch of wall strangely devoid of staircases for 100 meters in either direction. But then the darkness deepened, stretched off into a third dimension of distance, and I realized I was staring right into the mouth of a wooden archway built for a giant. Vertigo gripped me and my feet stumbled to a halt amid the books. That single archway was 60 feet tall and 100 feet wide, but it was not the size that stopped me. The rest of the Library of Carcosa had already inoculated me against that. Size didn't matter, but darkness did. Distant glow-globe light struggled a few feet down the unseen passageway, but beyond that lay a wall of night, a suffocating blanket of subterranean pressure, a nothingness. It was a hallway, a corridor, but I could only see it as a pit. Lady Morel. Saldes drew to a halt and her machine turned to face me. We have to go through that? Saldes raised her eyebrows, not quite following, but then lit up with a silent, amused O on her lips. Fear of the dark is nothing to be ashamed of. Quite natural, quite rational. Very sensible, in fact. There's nothing natural about that darkness. Is it safe to pass through there? I'm serious, and don't leave anything out. Safe? Saldes laughed. No, absolutely not. I blinked. But you said. I said fear of the dark is very sensible. Did I not? She tooted. I huffed a sigh and rolled my eyes, but Saldes waved a hand and carried on. I've only passed that way once and I did so with all my hatches firmly battened down. The library does have a receptionist. A receptionist? Saldies huffed and threw her hands up in frustration. The pair of rats in her lap rolled on their backs, as if laughing. Apparently that's the best your language can do for the concept. Yes, a receptionist, to screen visitors. But I subverted it. As far as the catalog system is concerned, I never really arrived. An inert ball rolled in, beneath notice. She sighed. Getting out is less trouble than getting in. You won't have to demonstrate your worthiness to handle the light of knowledge, but you and your bodyguard will require some actual light. Else you are likely to be eaten. Light, I echoed, staring into that darkness again. Against that? And that will protect us? Saldies nodded. But I don't have a torch, I trailed off and rolled my eyes at myself. Power thrummed from my abdominal reactor as I turned up the rainbow-strobing bioluminosity in all 6 of my tentacles. One around each of my legs as biomechanical braces, another wrapped around my midsection in a self-hug, another 2 held aloft like raised torches, and a final one trailing behind me, embracing the knight's free hand and forearm to keep him close. I slipped the squid skull mask back on over my head, for whatever protection it might offer in the dark. Oh, bravo! Saldies gave me a little round of applause. I don't think she was being sarcastic. Very fetching. I feel like I'm at a rave, I sighed, blushing with the absurdity of how I must have looked, unable to keep the sarcasm out of my voice. Not that I've ever been to a rave. Maybe I should ask Rain to take me to one, I'd be very popular like this. You don't sound very happy about it, Lady Morel. Never mind. I stomped past her, leading the knight. The palace is on the other side of this, you're certain? Quite certain. And past the lake. A short little jaunt, nothing really. And you can't just slap a memory into me again, have me teleport. Saldies drew in a breath between her teeth. Oh, we're not in enough danger for that. Not something I want to do more than once. Might have emotional repercussions for you. I sighed. Right. Are we going, then? Saldies looked up at the wall of darkness. For a moment she didn't say anything. I turned to her, expecting a sarcastic comment on her lips, but found instead a strangely contemplative and melancholic look in her eyes, distant and far away as she stared into the dark. For just a moment, she seemed as old as she must have been. Well, she sighed. I don't suppose I'll be coming back this way soon. Perhaps it's time I stopped being a pure scholar for a little while. What were you, before? Saldies smiled, sharp and dangerous and full of pleasure. A terror. An involuntary shiver went down my spine. I'd spent enough time around real killers and monsters to identify a genuine boast. Well, little ones, Saldies said to the rats in her lap, stroking their heads with her thumbs. It's time for a bit of a longer sleep, yes? Nothing to worry about, we'll be out the other side in no time, and I'm sure your brother will catch up with you soon. I glanced back at the forest knight. Is it all right for me to take the knight through this? Him. Saldies ran her eyes up and down the knight. Oh, certainly. Just have him stay close. Would be such a terrible shame to leave him behind, after all. She winked at the knight, then licked her lips and wiggled her eyebrows too. I do so adore the strong and silent type. Saldies, he's not even humanoid, I huffed. The occupant of this armor is a tentacle blob. A dutiful, devoted, sweet tentacle blob, I added quickly. The armor is just a shell, he's like a mollusk inside there. Saldies frowned at me like I was saying something mildly offensive. So. I don't discriminate. Don't be a bigot, Lady Morel, it doesn't become you. That's not I mean oh, fine, never mind. Quite right, Saldies said, giving me an awkward side-eye. Forget I said anything. Let's just go. Of course, she said. The gray blocks of her sphere machine began to close up again, sealing her and her pair of rats inside. It's a straight shot to the way out, but it can be a long walk, so I'll lead. If we run into trouble, I won't be able to open up, so keep your rainbows flashing. I nodded, trying to quiet the fluttering nerves in my belly. Saldies shot me a wink as the front of her machine flowed shut. As soon as she was sealed inside, the machine resumed trundling toward the vast wooden archway and the thick, cloying darkness within. I swallowed past a growing lump in my throat and forced myself to pick up my feet and follow her, step by shaking step, guiding the night along behind me. The archway loomed tall as we approached. Darkness lurked inside, a wall of a stale air. I felt so very small. What a paradox, I had plunged into the abyss, a truly infinite space, and we were currently in the library of Carcosa, a place so vast the human mind had trouble dealing with it, but here I was, afraid of the dark. I glanced up as we passed below the wooden archway. Letters as long as I was tall were inscribed on the wood itself, in some long-forgotten or non-human language, an angular alphabet of spikes and spines. I couldn't read a word of it. Beyond the letters, leaning down from the floor above, a small group of squid-faced librarians were watching us leave. I raised a tentacle to wave to them, but none waved in return. The gesture made my rainbow light waver in the darkness ahead, pushing the black depths back inch by inch. Saldies crossed the threshold first and the gloom swallowed her gray sphere. I followed, hand in tentacle with my knight, wrapped in my protective bubble of color and light as the darkness closed in tight. Darkness. Complete and total. Not a mote, not a flicker, not a pinprick of light in the void. Darker than the most overcast night on earth, darker than a mineshaft miles underground, darker than even the abyss. At least out in the abyss the membrane served as a surface, filtering the light of reality to the upper reaches, no matter how crushing the black depths down on the ocean floor, at least out there other creatures occasionally pulsed and sparkled with bioluminescence, or gathered around the heat glow of geothermal vents, or flared in bright arcs of violence. In the dark passageway, all suns had gone out. There was only me, only the light of my 6 tentacles. The gentle rainbow illumination maintained a soap bubble of fragile light, just enough to see a meter or two of the polished oaken floorboards in every direction, just enough to keep the knight safe as he stuck close to my back, just enough to pick out the rear of Saldi's sphere as it crept along in front of me. If this place had walls or a ceiling, they were too far away for sight. Once, I glanced back, past the knight, expecting to see the wooden archway and the distant glow of the library, but the archway had been swallowed by the dark. No books littered the floor. No dust lay on the tessellated boards. Saldi's sphere rolled along, but made no sound. Neither did my own footsteps. We made it perhaps 20 minutes before I started to have a panic attack. I wasn't afraid of the dark. Even as a small child, it hadn't bothered me much. The world is very different when you have a twin whose hand you can always hold in dark places. Maisie and I would always wake the other up if we had to use the toilet in the middle of the night. We'd go together, because nothing and nobody could harm us together. I had one particularly delightful memory which I'd managed to finally re-embrace, those last 6 months of when our parents had taken us out for a walk in the woods a little too late in the day, and we'd both grown nervous and jumpy as the sun had begun to set, casting skeletal shadows through the trees. Of course, we'd been no more than 5 minutes' walk from the car, in the middle of a well-maintained public park, shepherded by our parents, but a little girl's mind sometimes doesn't take those factors into account. Maisie and I had each wriggled off a glove her left, my right, and held hands, skin to skin, walking side by side with the sort of solemn seriousness that only children can. What is there to be afraid of in the dark when there's 2 of you? After Wonderland, there was plenty. I had worse things to be afraid of. But this was no mere darkness. As we walked deeper into the passageway leading out of the library, the darkness seemed to thicken around the edges of my fragile bubble of rainbow light. In my peripheral vision I saw the shadows press inward, shaving off the edges of my rainbows, as if testing the resistance of my illumination, but the optical illusion always passed whenever I looked directly at it. I was certain there were silent things moving just beyond the range of my light, vast presences and awarenesses in the black depths, always parting and slithering away before the weak lamps of my tentacles so that I would never see them. The silence was unbearable. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heart and the hissing of my own breath. As the minutes stretched longer and longer, I began to hear the pump of my own blood in my veins, the tiny gurgles in my stomach, the fluid inside my inner ear, the creak of my muscles and tendons. My heart hammered faster and cold sweat ran down my back and a weight began to settle on my chest. There was nowhere to turn, no light to be seen, no end to the dark. We walked through a void. If I turned left or right and lost my way, I might walk forever. Sal Saldes. I hissed at the rear of her sphere machine. Saldes, I need to. To what? All I could do was keep walking. The knight's hand in my tentacle was cold comfort, but at least he was here with me. I sucked air through a closing throat and hugged myself with a tentacle, drawing my hoodie tighter as if I could shelter from the dark. I eased a control rod out of my bioreactor and turned my tentacles brighter, but it didn't seem to make any difference to the darkness, did not expand my refuge of light. The panic attack did not pass, but sapped my energy and my willpower, made me want to curl up and hide. My feet began to drag and my pace slowed as I worked harder and harder just to breathe. Then, for just a heartbeat, a thin band of gloom separated me from the rear of Saldes' sphere. The separation lasted less than a second as I picked up my pace, my blood curdling at the prospect of being left behind. The rear of the gray sphere floated back out of the darkness as I caught up, but suddenly the rainbow illumination at the front of my bubble was swallowed by shadows. I slammed to a stop as if I'd been about to run off a cliff, the night stopping with me. My rainbow bubble was cut off by a straight line of darkness. I took a step back and the illumination returned, like an obstacle had been removed from the front of a torch. It was a wall of darkness, literally, a straight line blocking my way. Somehow, I could still see the rear of Saldes' machine, trundling slowly away from me, vanishing into the void. Saldes. I hissed, my voice a scratchy, panicked mess as my chest felt like it was collapsing. Saldes, stop. I slammed a full control rod's length out of my bioreactor and flooded my tentacles with bioluminescence, but that didn't help, the wall of darkness did not permit illumination. Saldes' sphere machine was finally swallowed by the gloom ahead, leaving me behind. Saldes. I whispered. She wasn't coming back. All around me, the darkness seemed to press in, and this time the effect did not stop when I stared at the edge of my rainbow light. My bubble of light shrank, rainbow strobing bioluminescence compacted, inch by inch. The night drew in closer too, huddling inside the safe zone created by my tentacles. Oh, that's a stupid trick, I hissed out at the dark, trying to turn terror into anger even as I was panting and shaking. How could I possibly see the back of Saldes' machine if light doesn't cross this barrier? I'm not stupid. That's impossible. But the darkness wasn't listening. Hastur may have been moved by defiance and courage, but darkness doesn't care. My sphere of safety drew smaller and smaller, no matter how much energy I poured into my tentacles, no matter that I made them blaze until they itched and burned and ached with the effort. The darkness drew in so tight that I started to hunch, that any moment the night would be swallowed first, and I would follow soon. After. All right, I hissed, about to break, terrified out of my mind, clinging to the night. All right. You want light? You want to see how much light I can make? Fine. Don't say I didn't warn you. I jammed my hands down into my own deep, unknowable darkness, into the eyes' lessons, dredging them from the toxic black tar which stained my soul. And I found a dozen ways to make an awful lot of light. Darkness closed its jaws around me as I scrambled to make light. The eyes' lessons presented a dozen methods to bend physics to my will, or break it entirely, or apply it in ways that only worked outside, far from the watchful constraints of Earth's reality. I might combust the air itself with an infinite gout of flame, or summon a gigantic arc of electrical discharge, or gather a handful of hydrogen atoms and squeeze them together until their protons began to fuse. Other methods had no earthly analog. The eye's lessons whispered of ways to light my skin itself with the power of a star, to blaze hot without fire, to cut through darkness with laser and microwave, to cook the shadows themselves until they might illuminate the whole planet with the pyre of their death. But choice was almost my undoing. Rummaging through the equations already ate up a precious second. I couldn't do this at the speed of thought, it was all so new and experimental. I keened through clenched teeth as I exposed myself to the toxic corrosion of the eye's lessons, head filled with stabbing pain, stomach clenched in desperate desire to purge a sickness from my body. The process took a toll of both pain and time, the former I could endure, the latter I had little left to spend. My bubble of rainbow bioluminescence was shrinking, my tentacles a flickering ember against the dark, my walls breached and overtopped by a siege of shadows. The forest knight and I had less than a meter of refuge left. I pressed myself close to his side so that I wouldn't lose him. Blackness lapped closer and closer to my toes and began to touch the edge of the knight's other arm. I threw away another half-second to examine and discard 7, then 8, then 9 ways of making light. The hyperdimensional details of each one made me retch and choke. None of these will, I babbled in panic, bloody spittle on my lips. The hyperdimensional mathematics were undeniable, none of these methods could overcome the dark. All of them would make light, yes, all of them functioned, but that wasn't the problem. The eye's teaching was accurate and true, it had left me no traps, held nothing back. That very same fullness of instruction informed me that all these methods would fall short. None of them would pierce this darkness. My 6 tentacles were already overheating, burning and itching as I poured energy into them in a vain effort to flood the air with bioluminescence. I was already pouring out a torrent of light, to no avail. Fire or electricity or slamming atoms together would prove just as futile, which was lucky, because in panic I began to execute that last one before I realized it wouldn't work. I began to weave the equation which would pluck hydrogen atoms from the atmosphere, ball them up, and squeeze them hard. But I let the equation collapse in horror as I realized that light was not the solution. That attempt cost me another 2 seconds, 2 seconds of convulsive dry heave and throbbing headache. The pain was a vice widening inside my skull, threatening to burst my brain. My nose ran with blood and my eyes flared with pain, and a sticky sensation seeped from the sockets behind my squid skull mask. I would have crumpled if it wasn't for the knight's free hand holding me up by the scruff of my neck. No source of light would piece this darkness, a deeper principle was at work here. The eye's lessons, long buried but comprehensive beyond human imagining, explained this in painstaking detail and offered an obvious solution. Darkness was the absence of light, but this darkness was the presence of absence. Absence could not be detected with human senses, not without presence with which to compare. But here it had presence, because we were outside. The trick was to observe the absence. My body shied away from that solution so hard that I almost choked on my own tongue. Then, we ran out of time. Darkness finally engulfed the forest knight's opposite side, swallowing his elbow and part of his forearm, despite his efforts to stay within the contracting bubble of safety. A sound broke the silence of the dark passageway, a rustle like petals of dead flesh drawn over metal, a brushing and a scraping like steel wool on stone, repeated and overlapping itself like a broken audio program trying to play the same note 1,000 times. It was so soft, so gentle, so subtle that if one was not sunk deep in the darkness, one might doubt it was a real sound at all. The dark touched the toes of my left trainer, pressing in so tight that my tentacles themselves would soon fall into shadow. And then, as I was still trying to process the eye's solution, darkness flowed over my left forearm. A sensation like 1,000 dry tongues slithered over my exposed hand. My skin crawled with revulsion, my blood went cold, and I think I screamed. It was as if every inch of darkness contained infinite layers of feelers, running over my flesh and probing at the sleeve of my hoodie, stroking me with the blunt underside of a billion claws. Implications be damned, I ran headfirst into the eye's lesson rather than be swallowed by that. Back in Lazzie's dream dimension this principle had come easy, but accepting it in the flesh was a leap I'd been unwilling to take, even if only subconsciously. I'd spent weeks pushing myself closer and closer to this edge, but here it was at last, undeniable and inevitable. I had to do it quick and dirty, not the full transformation I'd achieved in the dream. This was not going to be beautiful or elegant or euphoric. Mostly it was going to hurt. I opened my eyes as wide as I could, ignoring the blood which made my eyelids stick together, and then made tiny adjustments to my eyes with pneumosomatic flesh. I added lenses and layers that existed in both the physical and the metaphysical. I flooded new mucous membranes with fluids that had no place in the human body. I catalyzed processes inside my cone and rod cells, to make them do more than just capture light. Agony screamed through my optic nerve and extraocular muscles, like a serrated icepick to my face. I span up an equation that made me gibber and shake and bleed from my hair follicles. I stared out into the darkness, peeled back a set of eyelids I'd had closed all my life, and I observed. For a split second I saw the presence of absence. I understood, in both the molecular and metaphysical sense. And I knew how to make it go away. With my sight with hyperdimensional mathematics expressed through the power of seeing and knowing, I reached out and gathered together that handful of hydrogen atoms I'd been about to crush earlier. I made sure this would work, that this version of the equation would negate absence, piling on layers of metaphysics that only the eye would have understood. I crushed that ball of atoms tight, overcoming the nuclear forces not with sheer strength but with the inevitability of editing reality. I picked a pair of atoms, aimed them at each other, and slammed them together. Protons fused. A pinprick of light shattered the darkness. Achingly bright, hot enough to burn out my human retina, and about to grow, to expand, to wash clean not only the darkness but everything it touched. It was only then I realized I'd made a huge mistake. This was it, this was where I was going to die, consumed by nuclear fire that I'd summoned not in panic, but in pure superiority. In arrogance. In imitation of my teacher. I'd made myself a little bit more like the eye, and in the process I'd lost track of what I was doing. Observation is a heady drug. My ocular adjustments began to collapse, my mouth hinged open to scream, and my regrets drowned me. Lozzie would be stuck outside forever, Evelyn and Rain would never know what had become of me, and Maisie would wither away to nothing, never to see home again. A small, pale, blood-stained hand emerged from the darkness and smothered the atomic spark. Yellow light bloomed across the tessellated floorboards, the color of a shaded desk lamp on a stormy night, a candle flicker in a ship's cabin among the gloaming waves, wan flowers beneath winter sun. Yellow chased away the darkness, giving me in the forest night 8 feet of breathing room in every direction. Yellow cradled me as I sagged and crumpled and fell to my hands and knees. I yanked the squid skull mask off my head and let it roll across the floor, retching and twitching and spitting bile from quivering lips. I barely resisted a tidal wave of dysphoric urge to claw at the burning sensation behind my eyes as the pneumosomatic additions turned to ash, as my optic nerve reacted like a torn muscle, as normal sight wavered in and out, familiar but horribly alien and wrong and not what I was meant to see. A sigh of shaking relief floated through the air. "Oh, Heather," somebody said in my own voice, with a tremble of sickeningly earnest concern. I looked up from the floor and found a blood-drenched Nightmare staring back. "Sevens," I said. She was the source of the somber yellow light. It glowed from her like a shrouded beacon on a lonely hill. The darkness appeared skittish and reluctant to intrude. She was clothed in my musculature and wearing my face again, dressed like me but modified to attend a rave I would never enjoy. Blonde highlights graced my plain hair, light-up shoes flashed on the end of my feet, rainbow tights wrapped my scrawny legs, a white and pink belt looped around my waist, and 3 fingerstrokes of yellow paint marked my cheek. But she was also covered in blood. Her nose ran with crimson, eyes gummed with scarlet, mess all over her face, cut through with pink froth tear tracks from her eyes. Even her hairline showed a sticky residue. Her own blood, my blood, was smeared down the front of her pink hoodie and rubbed into the sleeves in great long streaks. Her hands were filthy with bloodstains too, even the fist she was holding out in front of herself to contain the nuclear reaction I'd unwittingly sparked. Her clothes were stuck to her with cold sweat, rumpled and disheveled. She'd mirrored my 6 tentacles as well, 6 slender, graceful, rainbow-strobing limbs emerging from her flanks, through the fabric of the hoodie. An abyssal creature soaked in blood, exhausted and harried at the end of her rope. "I'm so sorry," she said, voice trembling, brow creased with tearful worry. "I should have gotten over myself sooner." "Are you hurt?" My eyes in her face were dark and hollow, the sockets flowering with strange bruises. My face on her soul was gray with stress. I stared at her for a groggy moment before I realized she was mirroring me exactly, blood and bruises and all, despite the different clothes. "Do I really look that awful?" I croaked. "I'm sorry." Sevens boggled at me with my own gormless expression, then glanced down at herself, spluttering with embarrassment. "Oh, well, it's not that bad." "I look barely human," I mumbled, then groaned at the ache in my eyes as I squeezed them shut. The bruises on Seven's face were not for show. My eye sockets and facial muscles hurt like I'd been beaten with a rolling pin by Preem in a very bad mood. With help from my tentacles I slowly and painfully climbed back to my feet, legs shaking and unsteady, as if I'd just run a marathon. I scrubbed my face on my hoodie, trying to clear the worst of the blood out of my eyes. Then I checked my left hand, wiggling my fingers, but it seemed none the worse for the split-second descent into darkness. The knight hadn't fared quite so well. The darkness had not actually breached his suit of armor, but his left vambrace was covered in a swirl of tiny scratches where it had been submerged in the black. He'd only been touched for a second or two longer than me. I shuddered to imagine my fate if I hadn't reacted as fast as I did. "You okay?" I croaked to him. He turned his helmet to look at his scratched forearm, though I knew there were no sensory organs up there, the motion was all for show. He gave an unreadable nod, then dropped his axe from over his shoulder to hold it ready in both hands, facing out into the dark, as if he could fight absence itself. "Wouldn't bother if I were you," I muttered to him. "But thanks." As I peeled my sweat-soaked t-shirt from the skin of my back, I realized my tentacles were stuck beneath some of my clothes, a new and confusing sensation. How had I gotten that badly tangled up? I rolled my shoulders and went to adjust my hoodie but found myself with a handful of skin-warm yellow cloak. Soft as silk, thick as hide, warm as an hour in the sun, the yellow of fresh butter and ripe lemon. "What?" "I can see it." "I can touch it now," I said. I maneuvered my tentacles out from beneath the cloak, so it would stop getting in the way. "Of course you can," Seven said, with a strange crack in her imitation of my voice. "You're in my light." Normally I wouldn't describe the experience of almost getting eaten by sentient, living darkness as lucky, but right then the aftershock of pure terror overrode any thoughts of romantic embarrassment. I was more than capable of looking 7 shades of drugrave right in the eye. "Thank you," I croaked, nodding weakly at where her yellow blessing had pushed back the darkness. "Heather, what were you doing?" She gestured with her closed fist, eyes filled with horror. Was that just mimicry of my subconscious, I wondered, or was 7 shades of sunlight appalled at what I had been about to do? I squeezed my eyes shut, winced at the pain, and took a moment to dig for energy reserves. Luckily, my bioreactor seemed none the worse for wear, still thrumming along in my belly. "Nearly blowing myself up, apparently," I said. "You wouldn't have taken the library with you," Seven said, my own tone of exasperation making me want to grit my teeth, "but you would have burned yourself to a crisp. You were unprepared." "Heather, what were you thinking?" There was not a lot of thinking involved. Mostly I was trying to not get eaten. Sevens shook her head, wide-eyed and open-mouthed, speechless, the very picture of how I might look at Rain in the aftermath of some madcap plan. She let out a humorless laugh, devoid of joy. You never cease to amaze me, Heather, Seven said in my own voice, trembling with affection. She was crying softly, swallowing and blinking in a failing effort to hold back the waterworks. I'm so sorry, I should have been here sooner, I shouldn't have let that idiotic crone drag you in here. I owe you more than that, she trailed off, furiously scrubbing her eyes on her sleeve. Goodness, did I really look that pathetic? A faint fluttering threatened inside my chest. I had to glance back out at the darkness. Moving my eyes made them ache. I thought about all the things I might say to Sevens, the question I ought to ask, and the fluttering got worse. Instead, I cleared my throat, awkward and thick. Sevens, can you get me home? Her expression was like an arrow through my chest, not the ugly twist of pain, but a hollow look of utter failure. No, she said, struggling with tears again. Of course not. Do you think I would have left you stranded if I could help? Do you really think so little of me? I sighed heavily, beyond exasperated, unprepared for this. I don't really know you, Sevens. Even now I'm talking to a mask, aren't I? All I know is your fascination with me. And that you like to watch. She sobbed, once, exactly like me. I did not find it endearing, it hurt. Okay, I hurried to add, stumbling over my words, gesturing a surrender with one hand and one tentacle. That's not fair, that's not fair. You've helped me, multiple times. Very seriously. I'm sorry, I didn't really mean that, I thought you were avoiding me, earlier. Running away when I needed your help, when you might be able to get me out of here, or help me find Lozzie. I'm sorry. Sevens controlled her sobbing and stared at me again. Do you mean that? Yes, I do. Not a lie, by only just. You have helped me, a lot. She nodded slowly and wiped her tears on her sleeve, but that only served to smear the blood around her face. She still sniffed a bit, but at least she'd stopped crying. Two of her tentacles, imitations of my own rainbow strobing beauties, reached out toward me, hesitant and halting, as if asking to hold my hand. I tilted my head with an exasperated look, a silent really. She pulled a shaking smile, tugging at my heartstrings. It was like looking in a mirror, and it made me equal parts nauseous and heartsick. Sevens, is this you crying? I asked. Or is this just you imitating me? Are these crocodile tears? She hesitated for a long moment, hollow and defeated, then said, I don't know anymore. I relented with a sigh and wrapped one of my own tentacle tips around hers, squeezing gently. She squeezed back. I couldn't say no, could I? I needed her. Thank you for saving me, I repeated, somewhat stiff and rote, more to soothe my own guilt at speaking so harshly to her than to make plain my gratitude. Nothing I could do was going to work, nothing until well. I nodded at her closed fist. And you really can't get me home? You can't even try? Or find Lozzie for me? Sevens took a deep and steadying breath, coming back from the brink of weeping. I'm sorry, Heather, but I can't get you back to Earth. She stepped a little closer and glanced at her closed fist, then opened it as casually as casting away a mote of dust. The nuclear reaction I'd started was nowhere to be seen. I tried to find a way back for you, but that horrible old crone is right, those dead hands are true vengeance. I can pass by them, even clad in your mask, because it is not me they want, it is you. They are too real to take to the stage, they are beyond my jurisdiction. Even if they weren't, they are not merely a mage's tattered soul. They borrow the strength of another. The I. Sevens as distraught me nodded. Then it really must be Alexander, I muttered, flaring inside with real anger. Channeling the power of his final deal. Why can't mages just stay dead? What did I commit murder for? For your friends. Seven smiled with pained affection, and it made my stomach curdle and my heart flutter both at once. That look on my own face, directed at me, was too much. I was a horrible little gremlin, too capable of sugar sweetness for my own good, but rotten inside. By that horrible old crone, I take it you were referring to Saldes? I asked. Yes. I wish you weren't following her around. She's helped so far, I said, feeling oddly defensive. Aren't you much older than her, anyway? Sevens gave me a little frown. By human standards, perhaps, yes. By mine. Well, she shrugged. Saldes is I don't like her. She's a nuisance audience. I'll put up with quite a lot of nuisance right now if it'll get me home. I assume you know we're trying to reach your father. Could he get me back home? Seven's face collapsed into a theatrical parody of anxiety, me at my absolute worst and most dramatic. She frowned and bit her lip, cringing as if from an imagined blow. Her exhausted eyes lost what little shine remained in them, replaced by the manic energy of desperate panic. Oh, please don't, Heather, please don't, she pleaded. He won't understand what I've done. Her eyes flickered down to the yellow cloak about my shoulders. This is not a confrontation I can let you walk into. I already told him, I sighed. As that yellow blob. I know. I told him what for. I threatened him, Sevens. I think it even impressed him a little bit. Sevens blinked at me, shocked. You did what? I told him to move aside or fight me. Didn't you see? I was busy, I was examining the hands. I did not see that. Sevens stepped even closer to me, my eyes in her face wide and bloodshot with near hysteria. But it makes no difference. Heather, you do not know what you are speaking of. My father is the king in yellow. He can be so silly sometimes, but he is not like me. You are walking into a terror that has crushed generals and kings, emperors and popes. I cannot protect you from my own father. Well, it's a good thing I'm none of those things, I huffed. I'm just a lowly university student. Can he get me home or not? Probably. Sevens glanced away, biting her lip so hard it must have drawn blood, though it was hard to tell amongst the smeared mess of half-dried gore on her face. But he won't understand why you're wearing that. I didn't have to ask what she meant. I tugged the yellow cloak tighter, instinctively taking refuge inside it despite the emotional ambiguity. It was so warm, like it had come straight from the dryer, inviting me to bury my face in the sun-kissed fabric. Even right then, exhausted and bloody in having one of the most paradoxical conversations of my life, I could quite happily have wrapped myself in the cloak, laid down, and slept like a baby. Won't understand? I echoed. Or won't accept? Seven's eyes flickered back to me, filled with fear. How had Rain ever seen anything attractive in me if this was what I looked like when afraid? I was ugly and pitiful, nothing to be proud of. Before she could answer, I lost my nerve. I huffed and gestured at the darkness lurking beyond Seven's bastion of light. We still stood in a void of terror, beneath a crushing pressure that could rush back in at any moment and drown us both. I cannot believe we're doing this here. In the middle of this nightmare. This is not the place for a heart-to-heart, Sevens. Can't we if we have to talk about this? Isn't there somewhere? We could go to my room, in the palace, she said in a voice of spun-glass fragility. I almost choked. Your room. She flushed bright red, unable to meet my eyes. That is an inappropriate suggestion, I apologize, I retract the invitation. Though if you want to. Not yet, I managed. I glanced at the forest knight too, embarrassed that he was being subjected to overhearing all of this, but he didn't seem to care. Sevens nodded with mortified relief. You're perfectly safe now, regardless. This light cannot fail. What is it, anyway? I asked quickly, just to change the subject, to get away from her implication. Normal light wouldn't do the trick, I figured out that much. It's just me, being myself, she said. The library is intended for family only, and approved guests, though those rules have been flouted for longer than they were ever enforced. Most visitors don't use the physical entrance. She laughed softly, a forced sound, me trying to make light of a bad situation. Obviously, I agreed. You merely lack the proper permissions. My fault, I am sorry. I never was one for stamping forms in triplicate and the like. Well, you lacked the permissions. Now I've made them official. She swallowed with self-conscious embarrassment as she gestured at my yellow cloak, her cloak, the piece of herself she'd given to me. I could leave you here in the dark, if you want, if you tell me you want me to leave. I'll go, if you want. You would be properly marked as allowed, now that I've made it clear. She shot a glance out at the darkness, a tiny, delicate frown, like me frowning at rain saying something inappropriate, faintly irritated at the dark. No, you can come with us, I said, slowly, trying not to think about what exactly she had made official. I glanced over my shoulder at where the wall of impenetrable darkness had barred my way. Seven's light had cut a hole through it, clearing our path. We should catch up with Saldy's, she'll be wondering where I turned back, gotten to. Seven's, wearing my face, looked so pitiful and abandoned. She looked how I might look in the wake of rain breaking up with me. A thought so terrible I could not acknowledge the comparison. My heart wrenched itself inside my chest. I would go with you, she murmured. I would not let you face any corner of my home without me. Then she hiccuped. Like a frog with something stuck in its throat. Exactly like me. To my everlasting embarrassment, I hiccuped too, then huffed and scowled. Sevens, I can't do this talking to myself thing. Please, can't you, I don't know, chose somebody else. Can't you find any love for yourself? It's like talking to Maisie. It's grotesque. Sevens nodded once, awkward and self-conscious my awkwardness, my self-consciousness, and then as she raised her head, she ceased to be me. The optical transition made me flinch in shock. Suddenly, Sevens was a whole head taller, built like an athlete, dressed in leather jacket and curb-stomping boots. Gone were the tentacles and the blood and the bruises, the lank hair and the hollow eyes, all replaced with a rakish grin. Hey, said Seven Shades of Rain. Better? Oh, no. Absolutely not. I shook my head, hands up in surrender, scared at the speed of my private reaction. The sound of Rain's voice had instantly put me at ease, unlocked whole groups of tensed muscles, made me sigh with relief just to see her. But it wasn't her, not really. You cannot be Rain. You cannot be her. That's underhanded. That's cheating. Seven Rain shrugged, smiling with a perfect simulation of Rain's blazing confidence. My bad. She pointed a pair of finger guns at me. Can't fault me for trying though, yeah. Yes. Yes, I bloody well can. Stop it. Right now. You're the boss. Seven shades of sunlight ran Rain's hand through Rain's artfully messy hair. When she finished, she had gained another 2 feet of height, 100 pounds of muscle, and teeth to shame a great white shark. Shaman, 7 shades of 7 feet plus, purred in Zheng's voice. She grinned and showed all her teeth. I flinched, my tentacles drawing back into a defensive ball. Sevens. I hissed. You can't just cycle through other people who are in love with me. Can't I? She rumbled, an exact replica of Zheng's understated, proud defiance. She even flexed her fingers and rolled her neck, limbering up for a fight. Stop it. 7 shades of muscular demon shrugged. Another, then. And in the blink of an eye she lost her height, her muscle, and her confidence. Gripping a walking stick, blonde hair gathered into a messy ponytail, hunched shoulders wrapped in an oversized cream sweater, Evelyn stared back at me, most unimpressed. The effect was uncanny, somehow more accurate than either Rain or Zheng. Perhaps it was the little details of mannerism, the clench of her fingers on the handle of her walking stick, the sour twist to her lips, the bags under her eyes. Oh, come on, I sighed. Evelyn. That's just ridiculous, she doesn't. Ridiculous, spat 7 shades of say, Evelyn's voice dripping with scorn, oddly comforting in this outside place. You trample feelings without even realizing you're doing it, Heather. Sevens, I'm not ignoring your feelings, I. Faint tears stained Evelyn's cheeks, angry and repressed. I stared at 7 shades of unrequited love, mouth open, stomach fallen through the floor, and had to remind myself very carefully that she was not actually Evelyn. No, I said slowly. No, go back to being me. 7 Say snorted with derision, turned her face away, and reverted to a mirror image of myself, short and scrawny and covered in blood. 7s omitted the fanciful additions of blonde highlights, stripy tights, and face paint. She even didn't bother mimicking my tentacles, but stood as a simple mirror of me at my worst, hollow-eyed and dirty and pathetic. Me without my abyssal side. Sorry, she murmured. I was still reeling, hands up in stunned surrender. Was that you? Or was that Evie? How much of that was Evie? She shrugged. Not sure. Okay. All right. I shook my head, trying to recover, slipping on my emotional footing. I glanced to the forest knight for support, but he wasn't even paying attention. Lesbian relationship problems were a bit far out of his wheelhouse. Okay, let's take everything that just implied about Evelyn and put it firmly to one side, because I cannot deal with that right now, thank you very much. Yes. Sorry. I was getting a little off track. With an emotional effort only possible under such strained conditions, I did exactly as I suggested, I put that all away in a box, perhaps never to be opened. Why are you only crying when you're me? I asked, grabbing onto any handhold to get me away from those thoughts. Is that you, or me? Do you have any real interiority of your own, Sevens? 7 Shades of Morel chewed her lip. What's the difference? A rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Quoting Shakespeare at me, I did that to other people. It was insufferable. Don't you have AAU? A favorite avatar, a favorite face, somebody I can talk to and it'll just be you? No. Sevens whined. You've already forced me onto the stage, I cannot stand here as myself. There is no me to join you on the boards, Heather. She sighed heavily, and I knew from the experience of my own face in the mirror that she was struggling to not start crying. She'd found my own battered pride and was hanging on to it for dear life. She hiccuped loudly. I'm so confused. A lump formed in my throat. I took a handful of the yellow cloak again, and did my best not to look away from Sevens as I asked, why am I wearing this? You were going to die, she told me. I had no choice but to give you part of myself. You do this same thing all the time, Heather. You make decisions, split-second decisions for the good of your friends, for their lives, their survival, during which you carve off pieces of your own heart. You do what has to be done. I did the same, because your mask has become affixed to my face. That sent a steel barb through my heart, but I kept going. And it is a marriage proposal? Seven sighed, flopping her arms against her copy of my hoodie, casting her eyes skyward into the dark. Technically, yes. It's traditional. Did you mean it as such? She shrugged with her hands and pulled a very sad smile. Do you know you can trick the brain by smiling, even when you don't feel happy? Making the expression causes a sort of reverse feedback loop, causes your brain to release the relevant chemicals. It's the same if you stand like a superhero. Ever heard of that? Sevens puffed out my chest and put her balled fists on her hips, striking a pose that looked utterly wrong for me. Like this. Hold it for a few minutes and it'll make you feel more confident. It reverses cause and effect. You're not a human being, Sevens. You're an outsider god thing, you don't have brain chemicals to trick with feedback. And the power pose phenomenon isn't true, anyway. Seven superhero pose collapsed back into my usual slump. Sometimes, acting stops being acting, is that so difficult to believe? The cloak is not just a symbol, Heather. I gave you a piece of myself. It has metaphysical weight. I did it to save you, I did what you would do, but that's made it real. So, you really are in love with me? I swallowed and found my throat dry, my hands clammy, my stomach fluttering. I don't know, Seven said, face twisting as she struggled not to start crying again, her voice quivering. How could I be? I am only a question. You have the answers, how could I be part of them? This isn't what I'm supposed to be, it feels wrong. It's all wrong, Heather. You've made me all wrong and now I don't know what I am anymore. I am sorry, Sevens, I don't know how to process any of this. I don't seriously expect you to actually marry me, she said quickly, embarrassed and mortified. I couldn't help but think she didn't deserve to be embarrassed at such feelings, whatever she was. We'll have to explain to my father, now that he's already seen you. But I still feel this, whatever happens, whatever he says, whatever you say to me. Whatever you decide. I cast about for an emotional handhold. Sevens, there's something I don't understand. Why haven't I seen you since you gave me the cloak? Why not just come talk to me? I am not meant to be a player, strutting upon the stage. It changes everything. How can I direct when I am involved? It reduces me to a mere voyeur. To direct players is one thing, it is what I am made for, it is my essence. But to watch those who I have become a part of? She shook head. It makes me filthy. I am disgusted with myself. She held her line against the tears, but only just. I tried very hard in that moment to keep in mind what 7 shades of sunlight actually was, behind her imitated flesh and the soft yellow light and the desolate emotion on my mirrored face. She was an outsider thing, not a human being, a godlike shard of some alien principle. I'd seen behind her curtain, laid my abyssal senses on the beautiful truth of her real self, the butterscotch fronds and sunlight ripples of her true body, which existed in a way I ached to be. That creature had fallen in love with me and could not process those emotions back down to a human scale. The thought made my head swim and my stomach flutter. Or, she was acting. Either way, I needed her on my side. I hated what I was about to do. Slowly, hesitantly, worried that I was making a mistake, I opened my hands, then my arms, caught between a warding-off gesture and an invitation. Seven stared, awestruck and terrified. This is not an answer, I managed to say. I don't know how to deal with this, I don't know if I can accept anything from you, and we can't do this here and now. But you are not wrong, you're not disgusting, you're just feeling things. Do you want a hug? Sevens nodded, fighting to stop her face from collapsing into tears. She took a few shuffling steps, then all but blundered into me, pressing her face to my shoulder as she held back dry sobs. Awkwardly, but not without a certain level of affection, I put my arms around her shoulders and wrapped a tentacle around her waist. My shoulders, my waist, exactly the same height as myself. My scent, my warmth, all a copy. A falsehood. But was the real core, inside the mask? Hugging myself was too cruel. It was like hugging Maisie. I tried not to think about that. You're not wrong, Sevens, I repeated. You're not broken. You're just in love, I suppose. That can feel very much like being broken. You would know, she murmured into my shoulder, with my own voice. The hug went on for a minute, then 2 minutes, with Seven's weight sagging onto me, our bodies pressed together in a perfect twin fit. I started to quietly panic. Was I leading her on? Giving her hope where there was none? Did she have hope? Did I want her to have hope? But she wasn't even a person. Well, no, I corrected myself forcefully, she was a person, just not a singular person in the normal way. Most of the people in my life were not strictly human, what was one more? But Sevens was so much more alien and other compared to Zheng or Preem or Lazi. Or even Tenny. A dark thought began to creep into the back of my mind. Wasn't this all too convenient? I'd been trapped by the crushing weight of the darkness, alone except for my brave knight who was as powerless as I, about to be devoured. Then, soft yellow light had burst forth to save me, to pull me back from the brink. And now Sevens was wearing the form of the one person whose presence I desired more than anything else in the world, the one person to whom I would deny nothing, for it was my face she wore, but I couldn't stop thinking of my lost twin. I didn't feel like I was standing on a stage. But would I know, if I was? Gently, carefully, so as not to make her think that I was rejecting her outright, I peeled Sevens off me and made a gap between us, just to arm's length. She gave me a fragile little smile, my own shaking face at my most vulnerable. She dabbed at her eyes with a clean corner of one sleeve, which only made her eye sockets that much bloodier. "Thank you," she murmured. "You're welcome. I think. Look, even if nothing comes of this, you're still—" I paused and cleared my throat, with some discomfort. "Actually, are you my friend? You have helped me, a lot. If you would have me, I would be," she said. "Well, okay," I steeled myself to say it. "You're that at the very least. It's just a bit weird when the only faces you can wear are my own, or those of my friends. This is a very surreal moment for me. I hope you understand that." Sevens nodded, glum and low, but not crying any more. I took a deep breath. "We still need to go see your father. The king in yellow. If he can help me." "He might," Sevens said, nodding seriously. "What about finding Lozzie? Can you help me do that?" Sevens shook her head. "My father wouldn't be able to either. She has gone elsewhere. He does not even rule every part of Carcosa, let alone all of outside." I bit my bottom lip. Then I really do need to defeat the hands, if she's going to be able to get home. "I suppose so," Sevens murmured. "What about everyone back home?" I asked with a sudden hitch in my heart. "Have you seen them, checked up on them?" Sevens let out a shuddering sigh, a note of alarm in her widening eyes. I cannot. Not now that I'm on the stage beside you. If I leave it now I do not know what will happen to the role I am improvising. I do not wish to lose it. There is no understudy to take my place. Not now." She swallowed, an obvious lump in her throat. "Well done, Heather," I scolded myself. "You went one step too far." But outwardly I nodded. "That's okay. I understand." "Well, I think I understand." I broke away from her at last, gently and slowly, her fingers trailing after me, and I stooped to pick up my squid skull helmet from where it had fallen. I didn't slip it on just yet, but instead reached out to gently touch the forest knight on the corner of his elbow. "Sorry you had to stand there through all that. I think we're ready to move again." He lowered his axe and turned toward us, awaiting our departure from this night realm. "I will walk you to my father's audience chambers," Sevens raised her voice ever so slightly. "With me at your side, well, we will have to deal with my siblings and cousins, but I am the equal of any of them. That would be helpful." "Thank you." I screwed up my doubts and worries, pulled the warm yellow cloak tight about my shoulders, and held my hand out to her, but to my surprise, Sevens shook her head. "I do not want that awful woman to see me like this," she said, and I was surprised by the suddenly revealed core of quiet defiance in her voice. My voice. Is that what I sounded like when I found courage? When I was prepared, when I was facing down the dark? I don't think she noticed, but I was speechless for a moment. Maybe that was what Rain saw in me. I cleared my throat. "You can be Rain if you must," I said. "I understand. Though don't do anything, not even hold my hand, not as her. Please." "No, that would be grossly unfair," she said. She cleared her throat delicately. Exactly like me broaching a very awkward suggestion. "There is no unmasked self, you understand. This will not be me. It will merely be an old mask, one that will not cry in front of strangers. It will be strange for me too, to don the guise of an intruder in your story. Do what you need to do, Sevens. So I can do what I need to do. I left that part unsaid. Sevens nodded, then turned her head sideways by only a few inches, and suddenly she wasn't me anymore. In place of my mirror image stood a completely different person, a young woman who had no presence in my memories, not even a passing familiarity. I could say with absolute confidence that I had never seen this mask before. She also looked exactly like I imagined a minor princess should do. Slender and slight, an inch or two taller and perhaps a year or two older than me, Seven's new mask had blonde hair cut ruler straight just below a sharp chin, brushed to perfection so not a single strand stood out of place, held back with a red hairband. A blunt fringe framed unnaturally turquoise eyes, wide and staring, not with the austerity of command, but with an unstudied intensity that marked her out as eccentric. That was a stare to unnerve Daddy's visitors. A neat little nose and a small, serious mouth completed the somewhat doll-like look. She wore a crisp white blouse with short sleeves, tucked into an ankle-length yellow skirt and neat, sensible black shoes on her feet. Ramrod straight posture, hands clasped behind her back, head tilting slightly to meet my surprised gaze with those wide, staring, unsmiling eyes. If she'd raised her chin she would have radiated aristocratic arrogance, but the lack of that single mannerism kept her firmly on my own level. But my goodness, she was intense. I balked a little at that strange stare. Ready to depart? Sevens asked. Her voice was perfect, trained, sweet but sharp. For a moment I lost my tongue. Remember, this is not truly me, Sevens said. It is merely an old mask. It seems like you. Sort of. I took a deep breath to settle myself. This was still Sevens, not some aristo daughter. But Sevens was an aristocrat's daughter, that was the point. Perhaps it was because she was finally wearing the face of a person I did not know, but I felt like I was actually seeing her at last. I like it, at least. She blinked and tilted her head again. Really? The tone of the question was impossible to read, an innocent platitude, a veiled threat, an unimpressed suggestion and an appeal for more, all at once. Are you sure you're not trying to appeal to me? I asked. Sevens blinked. Not intentionally. This mask, is this person still out there in the world somewhere? Or? She died a long time ago, Sevens said, level and cool. She would have approved of me borrowing her looks, especially if it sent a young maiden into paroxysms of confused lust. She was like that. Can you believe it? Without even a hint of smile, I could not tell if Sevens was joking. I hiccuped. Sevens did not. She was also very good at self-control. 7 shades of suggestively sexual offered me a slender hand, nails cut very short indeed. Shall we? I sighed, but I accepted her offer, slipping my hand into hers. She did not squeeze, but raised her eyebrows in acknowledgement. Come on, I said to the knight. He shouldered his axe and set off after us, as we walked into the pressing darkness, to catch up with Saldies, and to go see the king in yellow about a present for the object of his daughter's affection. Hand in hand, with the forest night at our heels and my heart in my mouth, 7 shades of sunlight led me out of the dark. At first I was rendered speechless, but not merely because of Seven's new and intense mask, her princess mask of starch and stares and silent implications. Despite the perpetual motion machine of my abdominal bioreactor, I was beyond exhausted between panic, fear, adrenaline, whirling anxieties, confrontations with multiple outsider beings, a moment of eye-like observation, and almost blowing myself up, all topped off with the cherry of a genuine emotional crisis. I was spent. My mind was running on fumes, my emotions were worn down to a stub, and I was probably suffering some kind of short-term adrenal fatigue. Not to mention the hunger. I would have eaten week-old chips right then. I would have risked Tenny's first attempt at cooking, or gladly scarfed down one of Zheng's offerings of raw squirrel. After the first minute or two of walking deeper into the dark void, when it became apparent that the living darkness was not impudent enough to encroach on Seven's 8-foot bubble of warm candlelight, my mind wandered into a waking doze. My footsteps grew heavy, my eyelids heavier, my brain slipping into automatic. A pair of my tentacles clutched the squid skull mask to my belly like a comforting plush toy. I tugged Seven's yellow cloak snug around my neck and throat, seeking refuge in warmth. Safe now, my instincts whispered. Seven's neat black heels went click 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 against the floorboards in an unwavering rhythm, her long yellow skirt swishing at her ankles, now and again revealing snatches of white tights on her slender legs. I kept sneaking sidelong glances at her new face in profile, her sharp cheekbones and unsmiling eyes, her clear skin and the straight line of her mouth. On the 5th or 6th lingering glance, I met those wide turquoise eyes staring back at me. Sorry, I blurted out. Slender eyebrows climbed toward her ruler-straight fringe. I'm just very tired, I explained, under duress from that look. Having trouble focusing. I can't get used to you like this. Does my countenance help keep you alert? Sevens asked. Her new voice was like a slice of lemon dipped in chocolate, sharply sweet and precise, leaving one unsure as to which flavor was the truth. I squinted, more with tiredness than confusion. I'm not sure what you mean. Does gazing upon me make your heart rate climb? Does it tighten your chest? Does the sight of me stop your breath in your throat? She waited a beat while I was unable to reply, staring dumbfounded at her unreadable intensity. I would have stumbled as we walked along if it wasn't for her hand in mine. Regardless, Heather, you may feast your eyes to your heart's content. Be assured, I am not self-conscious. I had to look away, blushing like I'd been sunburned, no longer the least bit tired. Sevens, you are doing this on purpose, I managed. Doing what on purpose? She asked. You know very well what I mean, I hissed. Alas, I am but a young and sheltered princess, she said, still measured and cool and not sounding sheltered at all. I am too far down the line of inheritance to merit training as a proper lady, and far too uncanny to bother with sending me to balls and galas in the hopes of marrying me off to some nouveau riche merchant. I am unschooled in the ways of the world. So you must tell me what you mean, kitten. I had been ready to face her again and roll my eyes at her absurd act, but that last word made me stammer and splutter. She still didn't smile. Not even a hint. She hadn't been exaggerating when she'd said this mask was good at self-control. Ah, here we are at last. She turned her eyes ahead and nodded into the dark, leaving me unfinished and raw. The way begins to open. I let out a shuddering sigh, expecting another flirtatious trick, but quickly discovered that Sevens was being serious. All around us, the corridor itself had finally become visible, as if seen through a deep haze on the edge of sight, like the world lit by the first feelers of a gray and rainy dawn. Ceiling and walls loomed out of the gloom, much closer than I had expected, perhaps only 20 feet away and rapidly tightening as Seven strode on with her unwavering click-click against the floorboards. I squinted in confusion, for the walls were not the same tessellated wood as the floor, but appeared to be made of bare, packed earth, wormed through with gnarled tree roots, some as thick as my entire body but some mere finger-width feelers. Staring out into the gray haze, I realized that Seven's soft light was going out. Her halo of warmth was shrinking and contracting, fuzzy at the edges as the gray pressed inward, grown so dim that the rainbow glow of my tentacles had begun to overtake it once more. Sevens. I hissed, heart leaping into my mouth, my free hand gripping the sleeve of her perfectly starched blouse, one of my tentacles looping hurriedly about her shoulders. Sevens, the light. She hushed me gently. Somehow her casual dismissal stilled my nerves better than any actual explanation. The light is no longer relevant. This is ordinary gloom. Oh. Okay, Blushing and embarrassed, I started to remove my hand from Seven's shoulder, but she caught it with her own before I could retreat. Wide, staring eyes bored into mine. You are perfectly safe by my side, kitten, she said. Don't, I whined. She let me go. That kept my mind firmly occupied for the rest of the journey out of the library of Carcosa, a mercifully short 3 or 4 minutes through the steadily tightening corridor of bare earth and visible roots. Seven's light faded, replaced by the faint glow of my tentacles and a milky, pale luminescence filtering in from somewhere up ahead, shrouded by a thickening bramble of roots. The corridor tightened to 10 feet wide, then 6 feet, then barely wide enough for the two of us to walk shoulder to shoulder. We were forced to press ourselves together if we didn't wish to snag our clothes on the hooked and gnarled roots. My legs tangled with Seven's yellow skirt, her scent stole into my nose, starch and soap and simple shampoo. The poor forest knight had to stoop, carrying his axe low in both hands. Then, as if stepping from a deep wood onto a lonely moor, the roots opened like petals, disgorging us into light like watered milk. Blinking, blinded, struggling to adjust to the weak daylight, I held my arm up to shield my eyes. I think I missed Seven's stumble, but I couldn't be sure. Oh, there you are, Poppet, Salty's voice greeted us. And you found a new friend. How delightful. You certainly do know how to make them, don't you? You could have stopped or come back for me, I muttered as I peeled my eyes open, still strangely raw and tender from my desperate experiment with the eye's observational theory, despite the watery texture of the light. Salties, why didn't you? But as I blinked away pink-tinged tears to clear my sight, my words trailed off, my mouth hanging open. My head spun with vertigo. Our escape from the darkness had placed us on a vantage point, on a hillside at the head or perhaps tail of a wide road paved with rose-pink bricks. A moth-eaten blanket of pale moorland unrolled at my feet, covered in grasses the white of mature fungus, the purple of dying flowers, and the yellow of mustard gas. The landscape was punctured through not with one lake, the Lake of Halley, Salties had called it, but dozens of lakes, shining pools of bright blue liquid that looked more like they'd been cut into the ground than formed naturally, each one ringed by steep banks of pale, bare, wet earth. Little copses of things that were meant to be trees dotted the high places of the moors, but they looked too fungal and moved too much to be anything like earthly plant life. Some of them were penned in with barbed wire, a rusty red at odds with the other colors of this place. The ground was coated in a thin, ankle-deep mist, wispy and ethereal, not dense enough to obscure details unless one looked toward the horizon, where one was met instead by the tall, dark, craggy impression of ancient leering trees at the edge of the fog. The rose-pink road meandered over the little hills and wound between the lakes, passing a massive signpost made of black stone, which was festooned with dozens of boards pointing in every direction, some of them straight up into the sky or down at the ground. Further on, the road was flanked by a collection of metal gibbet cages, containing inhuman skeletons long since picked clean. At the other end of that rose-brick road, all the way down at the foot of the moldy, rotten blanket, stood the palace of the king in yellow. I sighed, trying to cover my sickening vertigo with exasperation. Oh, really? I hissed. It did not help. The structure could not have been mistaken for anything else, because it was everywhere and it was impossible. Fairy-tale spires and rings of fanciful battlements reared hundreds of feet into the sky, far taller than anything possible under Earth gravity, many of them vanished into the omnipresent milky fog which hung in the sky in place of cloud cover. Great gray walls were punctured by decorative arrow slits and indefensible balconies, covered with mile-wide carvings and gigantic stained-glass windows, though the scenes in the stonework and the glass were too far away to make out. Built from a dozen different types of stone granite block, white marble, yellowed sandstone, red slate, and types I could not name, the castle was piled up on itself like a layered cake, but the layers appeared to recede forever, never reaching a crescendo, drawing the eye ever inward until one had to blink and look away. Far weirder were the spires and walls that emerged from the foggy sky, upside down, as if the castle somehow wrapped around on itself in a gigantic sphere which cupped this landscape in its hollow core. Bits of crenellation and clusters of towers stuck out at wild angles from every possible place in the milky firmament. If one squinted and waited for the shifting mist to briefly thin, one could see the layers of the castle piled up in the very sky above our heads. If there was a sun, it was obscured behind stone. Where the milk-pale light came from, I had no idea. When I glanced back over my shoulder, I expected to see the library of Carcosa rearing up behind me. But instead I found a dark hedge of roots and brambles, thick as night and twice as impenetrable, covered with ebony thorns of all sizes from pinprick to spear. A 12-foot wall of half-dead plant life, impossible to scale without tearing oneself to shreds. And visible beyond that hedge, more palace. It was all around us, as if we stood not on the moors but in a castle courtyard bounded in every direction by a world ball of a building. The eye of the storm. My brain was like a skipping record, it kept insisting that the library of Carcosa was so tall, practically infinite, surely it should have been scraping the heavens. Where was it? Where had we been only minutes earlier? We could not be standing here and not be in the shadow of the library, that was impossible. My senses were playing a trick on me. I crammed that thought into a pressure vessel. I was outside. I had to start thinking outside thoughts, or lose my mind. It had been easy to forget, hidden away in the void of the dark passage, and even in the all-too-familiar alien infinity of the library, just how strange outside could be. Learned behavior, I hissed through gritted teeth. Just learned behavior. Nothing to be afraid of. That was a lie. There was plenty to be scared of out here. We were not alone. Carrion birds wheeled in the sky and perched on the towers, little smudges of dark against the pale air. I guessed that up close they were unlikely to look anything like real crows or ravens. On distant hillsides, pinkish creatures with too many legs and rubbery eyes on stalks paused to watch us, like crosses between cows and spiders, before thankfully going about their business once again. A few hundred feet down the rose brick road a tall, spindly figure was tending to a clutch of the strange fungus trees, dressed in a yellow smock, barefoot and bald and without any facial features, like a human being stretched out to 12 feet in height and scrubbed of detail. It wielded a huge pair of clippers, snipping off a branch here and a bud there with glacial slowness, occasionally slapping one of the fungal trees when it tried to wander off like a slug inching away. The palace itself was visibly inhabited. I kept my focus on the portion in front of us, where the structure wore skirts of stone, flaring out into petticoats of overlapping walls and spindly walkways. Dim figures lurked behind the windows and on the battlements, little more than shadows or memories, accompanied by scraps of half-glimpsed yellow. Two nightmares perched above the palace gatehouse, where a pair of massive wooden doors stood wide to receive any visitor brave enough to enter. The first was too painful to look at for more than a second. A gigantic yellow trapezoid shape was balanced on one point, on the lowest of the palace towers, rotating slowly to reveal facets shining with inner light like a gemstone. But the geometry of the object was all wrong and my eyes burned with an afterimage even when I'd looked away. The second gatehouse guardian was a sphinx. It was yellow, and the size of a building, but in every other aspect it was just a sphinx. Body of a lion but with a human face, with a pair of massive white feathered wings lying in repose. It would not have looked out of place in an illustration of ancient Greek or Egyptian mythology. Lounging directly above the gatehouse, massive tail slowly swishing through the air, it watched us at a great distance with deceptively sleepy, heavy-lidded eyes, set in an elegant, androgynous face. Yellow eyes, the color of lightning. I had the most powerful urge to put my squid skull mask back on, that I might hide from that stare. "And who are you, Poppet?" Saldes was saying as I was busy trying not to have a panic attack about answering riddles. "Can't say I've seen you before. Not in the library, anyway, and I wouldn't forget that face in a hurry." "Oh no, no indeed, I would remember those eyes. I would immortalize them." I tore my attention away from the soaring towers of the Yellow King's palace and his worryingly large pet. Salde's sphere was parked just at the edge of the pale pink road, open down the front. Milky fog lapped at its base, and at the feet of the forest knight, who was standing at a polite and safe distance. Inside the sphere, Saldes herself looked none the worse for the experience of navigating the dark. Her pair of rats sniffed about her lap as she leaned forward to peer at Sevens. Sevens stared back at Saldies with the same wide-eyed intensity she'd used on me, eloquently unreadable, plainly elegant. She'd let go of my hand so she could clasp them behind her back, radiating mild contempt. Rather than answering Saldi's question, she raised her eyebrows by a fraction of an inch. A question of her own. Neither would I forget such a bearing, Saldi's went on. Should I be addressing you in any particular way, my lady? I rolled my eyes. I do not have the patience for you two playing games with each other. Not now. Stop it. Saldi's glanced at me, faintly irritated. I am not playing a game, Lady Morel, I am being serious. Who is this? She trailed off, mouth forming a little "oh," as she turned wide eyes back to Sevens. Ah. Ah, Sevens echoed. Your Royal Highness, Saldi's said as she lit up, voice turning oily, delight cresting across her face like a fangirl before her favorite teen pop idol. She put both hands to her own chest as if trying to contain her wild heart. To my surprise, the pair of rats in her lap flopped and rolled in something approaching exasperated boredom. I frowned at them and could have sworn that both of them turned those little black eyes on me in silent solidarity. None other, said Sevens. I do beg your forgiveness, ma'am, I should have realized, Saldi's drooled out. Should have realized. I can be such a dunce at times, I do apologize. Well. I am honored that you have blessed us by deciding to join us formally and openly. No, you're not. And may I congratulate you on your betrothal? I understand you have felt somewhat shy in the past, and oh. And you emerged holding hands with Lady Morel. Saldi's clapped her own hands together with girlish excitement. That wasn't an act, of that I was sure, she was actually losing control, for real. You have reconciled then? No, no, wrong word. Saldi's hissed at herself and bit down on one of her own knuckles. Damn this English, it is so clumsy at times, is it not? She gave a nervous laugh and pulled an oily, fake smile for Sevens. I meant to ask if you and Lady Morel have indeed agreed to marry. No. No. No, Sevens repeated herself. No, you may not congratulate me. Saldi's blinked 3 times, slowly. Ma'am. 7 shades of sunlight, you're royal. Why don't you take your machine and roll it back into the library, you vile little slug? Sevens' voice, sweet and sharp, held not the slightest hint of disgust or disdain. Somehow that made it all the more intimidating. If she had turned that venom on me with those intense eyes and that aristocratic bearing, I would have transformed my own blood to acid and melted myself to escape the crippling embarrassment. Even at the periphery of her gaze, I felt the blowback like an emotional heatwave. It made me want to curl up and hide my face behind my hands. Saldi's was dumbfounded. Her mouth moved but no sound came out. Her eyes bulged as if she was on the verge of terrible anger. Sevens tilted her head to one side, turquoise eyes shining with esoteric promise. All of a sudden she was holding a closed umbrella in one hand, the tightly wrapped canopy a subtle lilac caress, the handle made of polished wood. She planted the metal tip against the road surface and tilted the umbrella at a jaunty angle. A threat, but so absurd I couldn't process it, she was threatening to hit Saldi's with a lilac umbrella. Stop, I raised my voice. Stop, or I will get very upset and probably cry. My tentacles, all except the one still holding my squid skull mask, rose in silent menace, as if I had any chance whatsoever of restraining these 2 inhuman beings if they decided to fight. I need all the help I can get right now. That means both of you, I don't have anyone else to. But then Saldi's, to my great surprise, broke into a manic grin, ear to ear, delighted beyond words, with eyes only for 7 shades of wildly offensive. Again. Saldi's cried out. Again, oh please, ma'am, again. She tapped her chest with her fingertips. Insult me again. Ah. Saldi spread the fingers of one hand, face deep in the rapture of true art. Mezubuta. Oh. Oh, yes. Saldi's cheered, then stopped dead with a frown. Wait, no, that wasn't English. What was that? Sevens answered by tilting her head the other way and adjusting the angle of her umbrella. Japanese, I think, I sighed, trying to straighten my back. The subconscious pressure of this outside place was making me want to curl up and stoop, make myself small so I could hide. I understood some of that. What are you two doing? Rest assured, my dear, Sevens turned and spoke to me. I take no pleasure in the act. The insults are real. And that is what makes them shine. Saldi's announced, rocking back in her seat and slapping an armrest. Her rats jumped. Bravo, bravo. Oh, I am honored to witness such a display, let alone to be the target of it. Sublime. She laughed, free and genuine, no longer oily and repulsive, grinning like a madwoman fresh from the attic. It is no display, Sevens told her. I do not wish for you to accompany us, you pile of offal. Saldi's controlled her laughter but not her smile. She rolled forward in her seat, sinuous as a snake, and winked at Seven Shades. I'm afraid you don't have a choice, ma'am. You can't seriously expect me to back off now, not when you've shown yourself and you're heading for one of the greatest shows I'll ever see. Besides, I don't think you would be able to stop me. I could, I raised my voice, staring at Saldi's. She raised her eyebrows at me in surprise. I could. I could probably find a way to crack your shell, you know that. And I'm betting Sevens could too. I shot a sidelong look at Seven Shades of Sunlight, expecting her to be death glaring at Saldi's, but she was already looking back at me, intense and unyielding. My words stuck in my throat at her scrutiny and I almost didn't get them out. But I'm asking her not to. Please. Seven Shades of Superfluous Superiority stared back at me for a heartbeat, then closed her eyelids in a glacial blink. An affirmative. The chill of that gesture made my heart climb into my mouth. She made her disapproval clear even as she acquiesced. Thank you, Lady Morel, Saldi said with a cloying tone and an irritating wink. While I am not certain in your ability to best me, I respect your confidence. That is not licensed to antagonize Sevens either, I said to Saldi's, keeping my voice firm. Seven Shades of Sunlight is my fiancée. My face burned, but I held her gaze. You keep your fascination with her at arm's length. No touching. Saldi's held her hands up in surrender. Wouldn't dream of it. Then she nodded at Sevens, a twinkle in her eye. Besides, I see you've already left your mark on the young princess. What? What are you talking about? I followed Saldi's pointed nod back to Sevens, then to the creased sleeve of Sevens' otherwise immaculate white blouse. That was where I'd grabbed her in my panic earlier, when I'd thought the dark was closing in again. Sevens followed the look too, turning her head to stare down at her rumpled sleeve. It wasn't the only flaw in her austere aesthetics. A few wisps of her blonde hair had been plucked astray by our passage through the roots, part of the hem of her yellow skirt was upturned from her brisk stride, and the low mist was forming condensation on her black shoes. Seven's mask was not artificial perfection. I had a sudden and confusing impression that she would be just as collected and elegant if she was covered in blood and sick, like I still was. Oh, I said, suddenly uncomfortable for some reason I didn't understand. Oh, yes, that was me. Made time for a spot of sneaky necking before you caught back up with me, yes? Saldi's asked, voice full of tease. I shot her a look. No. Yes, Seven said. I boggled at her, speechless and blushing. Saldi's cackled like the old crone she was. Sevens. I whined. Seven Shades of Unsubtle Insinuation watched me with those wide, staring eyes. You made the mark. Correcting it is your responsibility. Or your choice. I huffed, muttering under my breath as I stomped across the 3 paces that separated Sevens and me. Can't believe this, we're in the middle of outside, I'm exhausted beyond words and starving hungry, and you're trying to mark your territory. I grabbed her crumpled sleeve, straightened it out, and smoothed it down. But I couldn't make it quite perfect again. Sevens just watched me, her face far too close, until I looked up and scowled at her. And I am not your territory, as you are well aware. You're already sharing. Sevens glanced down at her sleeve, then back up at me. That'll do, kitten, she whispered. I spluttered and turned away, blushing beetroot red. Salties was beside herself, both hands to her mouth to smother a squeal, practically rolling around in her seat. And you can stop that. I snapped at her. We did not make out in the dark. Or do anything else. Yes we did, Sevens countered me, sharp and cool. For several minutes. Heather is an expert. I had to sit down afterward. Salty squealed so hard I thought she was going to burst from the top of her sphere machine. Her pair of rats almost fell off her lap. She kicked her legs and laughed and went red in the face, fanning herself with a hand though not as red as me. I turned away and folded my arms. My tentacles followed suit. For somebody you said you dislike, you certainly seem to have no problem amusing her, I muttered. I do it for you, Seven said. We stood there for a minute while Salties got her breath back and I stopped glowing like a space heater. Oh dear, oh my dear, oh goodness, Salties was saying. You two are a riot. Riot? Riot, crunchy. I like that word, oh yes. I think I threw a riot once, but we didn't call it that. Cease your prattling, Sevens told her. Yes, yes, of course ma'am, Salties answered offhand, letting out a big sigh. Oh, it has been a while since I was last out here. Doesn't look quite the same without all the pennants and pavilions, not to mention the destriers and cattle and the great big whale carcass. Whale? No, that's not right. Oh well, I suppose English lacks the word, never mind. The king's servants have done a grand job cleaning up all the gore, though. I finally got over my lingering embarrassment and turned to frown at Salties. She was gazing out across the unearthly landscape with genuine nostalgia. How long were you waiting for me out here? I asked. 10 or 15 minutes. Don't you worry yourself about 15 minutes, Poppet, that's a blink of an eye for me. Yes, Salties, I was very worried about wasting your time, I said, surprising even myself with the sarcasm in my voice. Why didn't you come back for me? I almost got eaten. Sevens had to come rescue me. I never doubted you for a moment, Lady Morel. Salties protested, looking taken aback. Besides, you had your fiancé watching out for you the whole time. You just said, she rode to your salvation. I glanced from Salties to Sevens, both of them watching me, and narrowed my eyes as a cold feeling crept into my chest. You two didn't plan this together, did you? Salties laughed. I wish I had. Never, Seven said. Never? Salties asked, a little sadly. Never, Seven said, slow as ice-cold venom. Oh well, Salties sighed. I suppose there's your proof. All right then, I said. Sorry, Sevens, this is too much. Can we concentrate on reaching your father? As you wish, Seven said. And I'm very glad your gentleman friend made it out in one piece too, Salties went on, nodding at the forest knight still standing a few paces away, his axe held casually over one shoulder. She even shot him a wink and coquettish little smile. Such a waste when men like that fall to things they shouldn't have to face. I truly think men should not be involved in war at all, they're far too pretty to waste on death in combat and besides, they're not. Sevens and I made eye contact with each other and silently agreed to completely ignore Salties. Sevens held her hand out to me again, the umbrella in her other hand held at an angle with the tip against the ground. She didn't need words, but just raised her eyebrows a fraction of an inch. I sighed and slipped my hand into hers, wrapping my tentacles closer about my own body. Then I tugged her yellow cloak tighter around my shoulders too, the best protection I could hope for in this outside place. But I left the mask off for now. Sevens tilted her head at me in silent question. Yes, I said. Let's be off. We set off down the rose brick road, hand in hand with the knight following after us. His metal boots made a gentle ringing sound with each step. It took Saldis a moment to break off from her musing about the nature of men which had descended into a treatise about nudity and realize we were walking off without her. Her grey sphere caught up a few paces later, Saldis herself peering out the front with a grin. "Ma'am, 7 shades of sunlight," she said, resuming a fraction of her oily tone from earlier. "How may I address you in this most graceful of forms?" "As your Royal Highness," Sevens answered without missing a beat. "No name?" Saldis struggled not to laugh, she was enjoying this far too much. "Don't start again," I hissed. "This might be normal for you too, but I am constantly on the verge of freaking out in this place." I gestured upward with my eyes, at the world palace in the sky beyond the mist, all around us. "Have no fear," Sevens announced, swinging her umbrella with each step. "This is my home, after all." The journey along the rose brick road was tortuously uneventful. My nerves, frayed thin by exhaustion and hunger, told me that I was outside, exposed, in the open, screaming in the back of my mind that I should be hiding behind a rock or digging a hole in the ground and waiting for the slip back to reality. Abyssal instinct whined and twitched at the slow ramble across this open moorland, over the crests of mushroom-colored hills and along banks of pale yellow grass. I wanted to slink into a dark hole and hide from the immensity, not to mention the slow, steady stare of the giant sphinx lounging on the distant palace wall. It watched our every step. But nothing else jumped out at us. Nothing descended from the clouds. No outsider nightmare came roaring over the hills. Paradoxically, that made my nerves worse. Half of me would have preferred to fight something with my tentacles. We passed the strange gardener creature I'd seen from the hillside. I thought of it as masculine, though in truth it could have been anything, paused in his achingly slow work of pruning the pale, fungal trees as we passed by. He turned to us, raising a spindly hand in greeting, 12 feet up in the air. Saldis rattled on, ignoring him. I tensed up and tried not to look at the blank expanse of flesh where his face should have been, or the slug-like motions of his fungal charges trying to creep away while his back was turned, but Sevens nodded politely and touched the handle of her umbrella to her forehead in a makeshift salute. "What was that?" I whispered once we were safely past. "A groundskeeper," Sevens said, unconcerned. "What else would it be?" We walked on past the huge black signpost with its dozens of suggested directions. Sevens did not pause to consult it, which was a relief, because trying to read the signs themselves made my eyes water and my head throb, though I was surprised to see at least 2 signposts which were very definitely written in French. We followed the rose brick road onward, to where it wound closer to the steep-sided banks of several of the unnatural-looking lakes. The road itself never dared violate the halos of oddly bare and packed wet earth around each small lake, but it ventured tantalizingly close. I couldn't resist the urge to stare down into the waters, if only to distract myself from my nerves and Saldis' constant stream of one-woman conversation. "And the last time I was here there were all sorts throwing themselves into the lake of Halley," she was saying, in hopes of rebirth. "Despite the fact it's never worked. Can you imagine? Most of them died before they got a chance to begin drowning, and the steep sides of each lake were vertically ridged, as if beaten flat by giant rolling pins, or worn smooth by animals sliding into the water. It made me think of seals or penguins slipping down the banks. As I stared into the sapphire-blue waters of each lake we passed, I began to see that Saldis had not lied to me earlier. The depths of each lake seemed to extend beneath the margin of the banks themselves, vanishing into shadow under the curve of the earth before joining with the brighter spots of other lakes further off. They were not lakes at all. Each hole was a puncture in the land. The true lake was subterranean, beneath our feet. Each opening allowed a narrow shaft of light to penetrate the gloom-filled waters. I squinted into those depths, able to see so much further than I would through earthly liquid, hampered only by the shadow of the land itself. And far, far below, hundreds of feet down, I caught a faint hint of sinuous folds shifting over themselves. A bed of snakes at the root of the world. Sevens, what are we walking on? I asked in a voice much smaller than I'd intended. She turned to me, eyebrows raised a fraction of an inch, then followed the direction of my gaze. Solid ground, she said. Then what is that? I whispered. Down there? A distant relative. She surprised me with a sigh. Best not stare. Right. Right you are. Of course. Very rude to stare. I decided to keep my eyes firmly ahead until we were clear of the lake and its hidden inhabitant, but that was not much better. As we left behind the dark punctures in the skin of this world and emerged onto the relatively open final half-mile of flat ground before the great doors of the palace, the Sphinx which had been lounging above the gatehouse climbed to its feet. Even at this distance the creature was truly gigantic. It was easily as large as the Great Sphinx of Giza, the statue back on Earth, 60 or 70 feet tall and well over 200 feet from nose to tail. Unlike the statue, however, it possessed a rough muscularity that made me think more of an actual animal than anything I'd previously seen outside. Yellow light from the slowly rotating trapezoid nearby caught the Sphinx's glossy yellow fur and fluffy mane, the roll of powerful legs and the swish of the tail. That light glinted in massive all-yellow eyes, set in a human face as big as a car. It stood up and spread feathered wings, flexing massive pinions in the milky mist, staring at us. Oh dear, Saldes said, in the exact same tone one might use to comment on a slightly fatter than usual cat. Yes, oh dear indeed, I hissed, stumbling to a halt though the creature was still almost a half a mile away. The knight stopped at my shoulder, but Sevens kept going for a couple of paces, still holding my hand until I dug in my heels and made her pause with me. Sevens, what is that? We can't, it's huge, I'm not big enough to deal with that. You will not have to, she said, cool and unruffled. My siblings are my responsibility, not yours. I will shield you from their questions and their disapproval. I stared at Sevens for a moment, then up at the Sphinx again, then back at Sevens. Siblings. She gave a single, tilted nod, elegant and concise, coupled with a gentle closing of her eyes as she tucked a stray lock of blonde behind one ear. An embarrassing admission. Oh, lovely. I get to meet the family. My head felt light and my heart skipped a beat. News of our coupling has already spread. Doubtless, some wish to offer their opinions. Those I will disregard. Some I may mock. The Sphinx of the 100 Gates, Saldes murmured from inside her sphere. I thought it was an illusion until it moved. I wish to meet this beast, very much. But also not to meet it, if you take my meaning. My protection does not extend to you, said Sevens. Saldes laughed. Of course it does, your majesty. But just in case, that's why I take my home with me wherever I go. Snail I may be, but snail I am proud. She wrinkled her nose. That sounded better in my head. Ugh. There is nothing to fear. Come. Sevens gently tugged on my hand. With fear and reluctance in my heart, I picked my feet up and walked onward, trying to resist the urge to throw my tentacles wide to make myself look as big as possible. I locked eyes with the Sphinx, but it did not look away. We passed the metal gibbet cages full of inhuman skeletons, and two spots where the rose-pink road branched off to head left and right around the castle walls, and still the Sphinx stared us down. Nothing will befall you, Sevens said. She must have felt how my palm had turned clammy. I managed a puff of breath, not even a real laugh. Yes, all safe here. All like a fairy tale. I slipped. Into a snatch of song, we're off to see the wizard. My father has been a wizard, at times. It was just a joke, I said, heart hammering in my ribs. That sphinx was massive, it could swat me dead with one paw, pneumosomatic tentacles or not. Wrong color of road, anyway. And this place is much worse than Oz. Not every place outside is savage, Heather, Seven said. I detected the tiniest hint of pride in her voice, so little as to not break plausible deniability. Some are much more refined than Earth. Such as here. Glad to hear it. Sevens, is there any food to eat in the palace? Human edible food? Only from my hand, kitten, she answered after a beat. Excuse me. I blinked at her, blushing again. On her other side, Salty's lit up with glee at getting a front row seat to this flirting. Accept food from no other, Seven said. Even my father. Only I may feed you. Oh, I really have been kidnapped by fairies, haven't I? I sighed. This is absurd, Sevens. I'm so hungry that I can't think straight, I don't want to keep walking, I want to stop right here and... I got my wish. One of Seven's siblings chose that moment to make clear their displeasure, but it wasn't the Sphinx. We'd all been watching the gargantuan feline as it had begun to pace slowly back and forth on the palace wall, huge paws patting with impossible silence for something so large, waiting for those wings to split the air and for the creature to glide over to meet us. The shining yellow trapezoid shape ceased rotating, detached from the tip of the tower where it had been waiting, and boomed through the air toward us like a jet breaking the sound barrier. It was like being bull-rushed by a piece of architecture. The trapezoid was far larger than the Sphinx and my body simply had no idea what to do, no more than it would if an asteroid was about to hit me. The thing bellowed as it raced through the air, a deep ringing sound like a gemstone screaming, blotting out thought and blurring the senses. I had only a second or two in which to react, but that moment was consumed by slamming my hands over my ears and wrapping my head with my tentacles to block out the awful noise. I stumbled and tried to duck, as if I could do anything to avoid the force of a meteor about to smash us all into paste. 7 Shades of Sunlight took 2 precise steps forward, opened her lilac umbrella, and leveled it at the onrushing trapezoid. It halted an inch from the tip of her umbrella, decelerating to a stop instantly, still howling. I actually fell over onto my backside, cowering in unspeakable terrified awe, trying to hide myself inside the yellow cloak. The yellow gem creature was the size of a skyscraper. Something that big should not have moved, nor stopped so suddenly, nor make those awful sounds. Salty's had closed her sphere up tight. The ancient mage was playing it safe. Perhaps she was just concerned about her rats. The forest knight had fallen to one knee. He was struggling to raise his axe. The trapezoid unfurled a dozen wings of glowing light, each one easily 100 feet long. It sprouted a halo of golden yellow, made of esoteric magical symbols which I couldn't even look at without feeling a nosebleed drip down my face. It howled and bellowed like a jet engine had learned how to perform death metal vocals, wordless sounds that couldn't possibly be communication. I crawled on the ground, trying to keep it out of my head. But it did not advance past Seven's umbrella. Sevens just sighed. Somehow I heard that over the din. Yes, brother, she said, cold and sharp. But it is none of your business. More bellowing, more noise like being shouted at by a mountain. If you would cease being so rude, I would introduce you to her, Sevens answered. But you are being a boor. I shall slap you if you continue. A crescendo of planetary rage. I thought my eardrums would explode. Father took a human lover once, Seven said. Without that, none of us would exist. A ding like a bell the size of the Milky Way. Why yes, I am comparing myself to Father. Lord knows, you can't. Silence. I looked up, shaking and shivering, tears running down my face with loss of control. The trapezoid had departed even quicker than it had arrived, reduced to a yellow spot in the sky as it fled upward into the castle. Seven sighed with the tone of one who had dispatched an unwanted caller. She carefully rolled up her umbrella, dusted off her skirt with one hand, and adjusted the angle of her headband. Then she turned and offered me a hand. I took it without hesitation and all but clung to her when she helped me to my feet, wrapping 3 tentacles around her arm with instinctive need. She was so slender and slight beneath her clothes, but she was like iron where I was shivering. Kitten, she murmured, gently drying my eyes with a handkerchief she had produced from somewhere. I told you not to be afraid. That is a bit difficult when getting yelled at by a piece of a moon. I squeaked, and finally managed to peel myself off her, embarrassed and self-conscious. Next to me, the forest knight slowly levered himself up to his feet, none the worse for wear. The king in yellow took a human lover? Salties asked as her grey sphere bloomed open again. Was that a bluff, ma'am? It is none of your business, Sevens told her. Besides, you had better get back in your ball, you rancid pustule. What? I asked, my stomach dropping. Why? But Salties was already closing up. I caught the whites of her eyes, gone wide in terror. Because that was the easy one, Seven said. She nodded toward the palace. Here comes trouble. During the commotion with the trapezoid, the Sphinx had hopped down to the ground. It trotted up the road toward us with dainty feline strides, each footstep the length of a house, tail swishing, eyes blazing with feline curiosity. My family didn't keep any pets when Maisie and I were little, after Wonderland or, from our parents' perspective, after my schizophrenia manifested at 9 years old they had enough on their hands dealing with me, without adding further complications to our household. My father had owned a dog in the years before we were born, a noble-looking German shepherd by the name of Alfred, though I only knew him from a handful of low-resolution photographs. He died at a rather advanced age when Maisie and I were only 6 months old, which invited a nameless melancholy whenever I thought about it too much. During my teenage years, 3 different child psychologists had suggested animal-assisted therapy, or that my parents should consider getting a small dog. That experiment lasted less than a week and ended in a massive relapse. 13-year-old me got her hopes up at the fantasy of a big friendly dog who would bark at her hallucinations and scare off the monsters nobody else could see. Which didn't happen. Dogs couldn't see spirits either. So, I wasn't good with animals. I was not used to them. But I had once been fascinated by a cat. When Maisie and I were perhaps 6 or 7 years old, our neighborhood in Reading had played brief host to a bold stray. A marmalade-and white tabby cat had taken up residence in the streets. She was sleek and muscular and graceful. Our parents called her Ginger, which Maisie and I mangled into Gins, in the private language that young twins sometimes develop. Gins the orange cat developed a habit of begging for scraps outside people's doors by rolling on her back and looking cute. She sunned herself on garden walls and promenaded up and down the pavements without a care, but she was also the terror of all the local domesticated cats. At night she would poach pet food from unattended bowls by sneaking in through unlocked cat flaps. More than once somebody else on our street woke up to the sound of their own pet hissing and yowling in a secret nocturnal confrontation. To a pair of small children this was the height of excitement and scandal. She didn't visit our back garden much, probably because we lacked any pet food to give her. On the rare occasions she did appear, Maisie and I were beside ourselves with delight. Gins was a very proud cat, all strutting and preening, somehow both fluffy and elegant at the same time, dignified and commanding, queen of her adopted domain. Our parents forbid us from trying to stroke her, which caused a little disappointment at first, but we accepted it as the natural order of things. No feline that noble would be interested in the attentions of a pair of over-curious 6-year-old girls. But once, she'd stolen into our back garden in pursuit of a big fat black rat. She'd caught it right in front of Maisie and I as we'd pressed ourselves against the glass of the back door in horrified awe. She'd cornered it on our little patio, toyed with the poor thing, then snapped its neck and taken her sweet time with her meal. She'd eaten it head first, crunching the delicate bones, smearing blood and gore all over her oh-so-fluffy orange face and paws. I always remembered the shared realization that Maisie and I had whispered to each other as we'd watched sweet little Jins dismember and devour her prey, as she'd watched us back with those shining feline eyes. If we'd been as small as that rat, she would have gladly eaten us. It wasn't until many years later that I realized poor Ginger had probably been slowly starving, covered in fleas, and riddled with parasites. Strays rarely have a good life. Her beauty and dignity had been an illusion. But as the yellow sphinx padded up the rose brick road on silent paws, making for Sevens and Saldies and the night and myself, that memory of predatory beauty came flooding back. The sphinx must have weighed thousands of pounds, but it trod like a dancer with muscles that flowed like butter, slinking and strutting with the grace of a poem as it strode through the pale mist which covered the ground. Its mane was a halo of dark gold, its velvety fur the color of fresh wheat, the swishing tail a lightning bolt ready to strike. Its great wings were folded down against its back, the rival of any rock. The skin of its human face was a rich, dusky brown, with plush lips in a natural pout, wide soft cheeks, and a pair of slender, arched eyebrows in stark black. Yellow eyes showed a hint of bronze-slit pupil on the background of dying sunlight sclerae. The Sphinx's gaze passed briefly over Sevens and the sealed ball of Saldi's machine, then settled on me. Those pupils widened, as if fixed on prey about to scurry away. "Stand your ground," Sevens murmured. Her hand, cool and dry, found mine again. She laced her fingers between mine. I hiccuped, loud and painful. "In front of that. She will not attack us." Sevens tilted her head, watching the Sphinx approach. "Not if she knows what's good for her." "Oh, great," I hissed. I think I preferred the giant screaming gemstone. I did my best to stare down the Sphinx as she finished her approach, more difficult than I'd expected, considering I'd stared down the biggest stare of all, but I suppose that had been in Lassie's dream, whereas my physical body was literally here, outside, trying to lock eyes with a 70-foot lion. A trickle of adrenaline turned into a steady pump of animalistic fear. The control rods in my bioreactor instinctively inched out of their channels, trying to supply me with raw energy to compensate for the gnawing hunger in my belly. I itched to slip the squid skull helmet over my face, but it would make no difference against something this size. If the Sphinx was indeed going to pose us a riddle, the last thing I wanted to do was risk muffling my voice. My fingers clutched at Seven's yellow cloak about my shoulders. My 6 tentacles crept outward to make myself look big, flushing their surface layers with toxins to make myself poisonous to eat. A hiss rose in my throat as the giant Sphinx finally drew to a stop in front of us. She settled on her haunches and regarded us with heavy-lidded eyes, from 70 feet up. I tried to remind myself that this was also a form of illusion. The Sphinx was a mask, the same as Seven's. But that thought died under a torrent of fight or flight. All I could do was stand transfixed. If I moved, I would break. "Sister," Seven spoke first, cold and polite. "What are you doing?" The Sphinx blinked with feline lethargy, then lowered her head and shoulders into a crouch so we did not have to crane our necks quite so high to meet her gaze. Her face alone was gigantic enough, and too close despite still being a good 30 feet away. Claws the size of battleship engine propeller blades slid out from between her paw pads. "Threat! Threat!" Abyssal instinct and savanna ape screamed in unison, and I broke into a hiss. Long and loud and shaking, my tentacles rearing like stingers. It was that or curl up inside Seven's cloak and choke on my own hiccups. The Sphinx turned lazy eyes toward me. I hissed again, so hard it burned my throat, until my lungs were empty and my head was spinning. Her gaze lingered for a moment, but then she looked away. If it wasn't for Seven's hand in mine, the relief would have buckled my knees. "You are eating from the refuse heap, sister," the Sphinx said to 7 shades of sunlight, in a voice like silk drawn over razor blades. That sound made me shiver and swallow, my throat all twisted inside from the hissing. The Sphinx's voice was far too high for something so large, and far too human, far too knowing and mocking and teasing. She indicated me with a tiny sideways tilt of her gigantic head, dark mane ruffling in the air as she moved. Then again, I already am eating from the refuse heap all the time. 7 shades of sunlight raised her chin. The adjustment was tiny, but it conferred upon her an instant air of icy arrogance, a full-on aristocratic transformation. "You may insult me at your leisure," said Sevens. "But—" "Too true I may," the Sphinx interrupted. Seven spoke right over her, "but you will show better manners toward my betrothed." "Or what?" she asked. "Or I shall take a spray bottle to you." Sevens raised the handle of her umbrella and extended one finger around an imaginary trigger. SSPPT SSPPT. The Sphinx's smile widened, acid and steaming. Sevens planted the tip of her umbrella back on the ground, chin high, eyes cold as a winter storm. I prepared to let go of her hand and leap away, my heart racing with terror, half my tentacles wrapped around me in a protective cushion. There was no way we were going to get lucky twice, was there? She'd driven off the flying trapezoid, but that had just screamed and bellowed with impotent anger, easily dismissed between outside beings of this order. The Sphinx wanted to play, as cats played with their prey. "I always enjoy your jokes, 7 shades," the Sphinx purred. "It is not a joke." "I will chastise you," said Sevens, then turned to me. She indicated the Sphinx with a tilt of her umbrella. "This is Tenebrous Melancholy of the Umbral Sands. Her name is a mouthful, so you may shorten it any way you wish, even to something insulting. Preferably to something insulting. Moggy, Mauser, Fleabag, as you wish." The Sphinx blinked with all the speed of an advancing glacier as our eyes met again. My heart slammed in my chest and I fought off both a hiccup and a hiss as I gave her a polite nod, my lips sealed against saying anything silly. But both of them waited. Sevens did not give me any help when I glanced at her. Neither did the forest knight when I risked a tiny look over my shoulder. He was standing very still, axe poised like a pike, as if to ward off a cavalry charge. Brave, but even he couldn't stop the Sphinx if she decided to crush us. Her tail swished, once. Melancholy Mel?" I croaked, my throat still raw. Mel, all several thousand pounds of her, rumbled a purr in grudging approval, a purr that made the ground shake. I'd passed whatever test the Yellow Sisters had set, but I just flinched again as she flexed her claws a second time. I couldn't stop myself from scowling at her. "Why are you being so large, sister?" Sevens asked her. "Cease this pointless intimidation. You know it does not make any difference to me. Only to Heather here." As Sevens spoke, Mel reached out with her opposite paw toward Saldy's closed sphere. She nudged it like a cat with an unfamiliar new toy, then planted her gigantic paw on top of the ball and tried to drag it toward herself, totally undeterred by the spiky exterior formed by the gray blocks. When the ball refused to move, Mel bared her human-like teeth in a silent grimace. Only at the sound of my name did she turn her attention back to us. "She is named after a bush?" Mel asked. "And I like being large. I should ask you to justify your current smallness. I've seen you much larger before and I think it suited you better." "This mask is human," Seven said. "They do tend toward smaller sizes. Then swap to a larger one. These instincts are difficult to suppress, they keep prodding me to pin you and bite your legs off." Seven sighed softly. "Don't make me come up there, Melancholy. You do not want me to do that. I am wearing a human mask because I am with a human. I will not leave her out of a conversation. To do so would be exceedingly rude." Mel nodded toward me and gestured at me with one gigantic yellow paw as well, though her claws remained sheathed. I flinched so hard that I stumbled back. My hand almost slipped out of Seven's grip, but she clamped her fingers around mine tight as iron, hard enough to grind flesh against bone. My stumble and her strength almost dislocated my wrist and shoulder before I caught myself, but my hiss of surprise and pain was lost in the razor-sharp song of Mel's voice. "This is not a human," Mel was saying as I recovered my composure. "I should know, I've spent more time among them than you have. I was being worshipped in adoring terror when you were just a half-formed notion lost in rat-infested brothels in the cradle of Rome." As soon as my hand was secure in Seven's once more, her grip went back to normal, but she didn't acknowledge what she'd done. She didn't even look at me. I was not to let go of her hand in front of this creature, sister or no. "Melancholy," said Sevens, cool and calm, "you are not actually the Sphinx of Thebes. Shut up and shrink yourself." Tenebrous melancholy of the umbral sands let out a snuff noise, the feline equivalent of an exasperated huff. She reared back up to her full height, sitting on her haunches and looking down at us with a most sour-lipped expression, her thick, dark mane framed from behind by the drifting sky mists and the dimly visible upside-down castle piled in the sky. Then, in less than the blink of an eye, she was suddenly a sixth of her size. The Sphinx went from a 70-foot colossus which my brain said should not even be moving to a mere 10-foot giant blocking our way down the rose-brick road. "Thank you, dear sister," said Sevens. "Now I will ask you again, what are you doing here? Are you escort, or obstacle?" Mel yawned, slow and lazy, raising a front paw to her mouth in a very uncat-like gesture. "Goodness me, you can be such a bore. I think I preferred you during your grand Gignol phase. Don't you remember how much fun that was? Recall that party of jesters we had skinned, what a great show." She stood up and padded silently over to Saldiza's closed sphere, now only about 4 feet taller than the gray machine, like a cat with a beach ball. She sniffed the top of the sphere and batted at it with one paw, but it still refused to budge. "Why can't you put your favorite human though some good old blood and guts, some proper ultraviolence?" "She does enough of that to herself," said 7 Shades of quietly boastful. Mel's attention flicked back to us for a second, a cat distracted by a dancing string. "Does she now?" "Look at her, sister," said Sevens. "I am not responsible for any of that claret." Mel ran her bronze-on-yellow eyes up and down my body, taking in the blood all over my sleeves and down the front of my hoodie encrusted around my nostrils. Her wide, dusky chocolate face was so expressive, eyes scrunched in curiosity, nose twitching with interest, lips pouted in consideration. I stared back, feeling disgusting but defiant, straightening my spine as best I could to show off my trophies, though they were all my own blood. "Look all you want," I thought. "I survive this and more, regularly. A bloody mess, yes." Mel grinned. "Has she been feasting upon her enemies?" "I approve." I sighed under my breath. "Something like that. That only means she would be even better suited to your former style, sister," Mel purred. "Why not make a grand return? We can dress the stage with her glistening entrails, paint the boards with her pretty brains. What say you, sister? How about a collaboration?" "Try me," I hissed. Mel glanced at me, unconcerned but curious. "One does not do violence upon the object of one's heart," said Sevens, measured and calm. "Oh, tosh and nonsense." Mel huffed. "I did plenty of that to plenty of strapping young things, though mine were admittedly more carnal. They usually ended up in my belly." She returned her attention to Saldi's closed sphere, suddenly raising a paw and batting quickly several times against the unyielding gray surface. "And what is this? Why won't it move? This is intolerable." "Our methods of expressing love are very different," said 7 Shades of unerringly polite. "If you presume to critique mine, then I shall return the favor." Melancholy paused in her futile attack on Saldi's sphere, shooting a suspicious look at 7 Shades of sunlight. "Love? Stage infatuation is not love. As soon as the play is over, she becomes immortalized in the moments of the performance, but not beyond that. You are wasting her potential. You wish to repeat a story forever, sterile and incomplete. Let us use her properly. You want the milk, not the cow, and have mistaken the latter for the former. Cow. I blurted out, outrage overcoming intimidation. Excuse me. What if the performance itself continues forever? Sevens asked. Melancholy snorted. These creatures are short-lived, they do not last, not even uplifted like this scrap of muscle and bone. She nodded at me again. But pain? Pain lingers forever. I should know. You want to critique my love, with your head full of rainbows? I am a vision of how you will end up. Sevens shrugged delicately, slender shoulders rising along with her crisp white blouse. You never understood love. I do. Melancholy rolled her razor-sharp, yellow eyes and then returned her attention to Saldy's sphere, peering around the sides for a hidden opening. She reared up on her hind legs and tackled the machine with her whole body, all 10 muscular feet of herself, trying to roll it along. The machine did not oblige, but stayed firmly fixed to the ground. She took a moment to bite at it, then grunted in frustration. Besides, I do not think she loves you, sister, she purred. I know, Sevens answered, without a second's hesitation. Not yet, I spoke up, tired of being a bystander. Melancholy spared me a glance as she let the sphere go and fell back to her feet, the interest of a cat toward prey making a mistake during a clumsy escape. I'm thinking about it. But I can hardly think it over properly when I'm in the middle of an emergency. Which you are adding to. Are you barring our way? Melancholy stared me down for several heartbeats, but I refused to squirm or shrink. She gave up on the sphere and padded back to Sevens and me, tail swishing slowly, bronze pupils dilating, making no effort to hide her predatory body language as she crept closer. The forest knight's axe inched past my shoulder in a futile effort to ward her off. My tentacles drifted back and forth, ready to strike or curl into a protective ball. Inside, I was shuddering and swallowing down a hiccup, but I did my best not to show my fear. I was a predator too, or at least I could be, at my most abyssal and ruthless. I tried to channel that into my stare, into my body language. Melancholy stopped 6 or 7 feet away and tossed her head. The strange hybrid's heart belongs to another, she said. Several others, yes, Sevens sighed. And that is acceptable. Encouraged, even. Sister, this is getting tiresome. May we pass? That is not what I mean. Her heart belongs to another. Completely. May we pass? You may not. Sevens had no quick retort to the refusal, which made my heart pound against my ribs with sudden worry. I shot a sidelong look at her, but her face gave nothing away. Instead, I cleared my throat and asked, is that why you've chosen a sphinx as your mask? To bar my way? It is not for your sake, hybrid. I wore this for so long it began to feel more real than my own face, she purred, slinking closer on silent paws. I am the Sphinx of Thebes, for she is no more, her bones worn away to dust and joined with the sands. There is only me left to keep the memory alive. Tail swishing, eyes flashing, she peeled back her lips and ran her tongue along her exposed teeth. I think it was meant to be a threat, but it was somehow miscalibrated. I thought you'd have sharper teeth, I said, but wasn't sure why I wanted to irritate her. And I thought you'd have a sharper mind, she shot back. Let us pass, said Sevens. Or you and I will come to blows. Not without a riddle, purred the Sphinx. One to open your rainbow-clouded eyes, sister. Oh, for pity's sake, I hissed. Really? Really, this is what we're doing? I'm so hungry I could eat you, so get it over with. You are the one who chose to be here, Melancholy, said Sevens, her calm voice dripping with understated reproach. This is not your usual haunt. You can't declare this as a toll road based on your whims alone. This road is the property of the king. Who do you think sent me? Mel growled. Our geometry-obsessed brother was the one here of his own accord. She tossed her head to indicate the glowing trapezoid which had vanished up into the jumble of the castle. Her lips curled into a dark smile. Though I would not say I am here under duress. I am rather enjoying this. Then you are to be my object lesson? Sevens asked, airy and unconcerned. Consider the object presented, the lesson acknowledged. You have performed your function. Now stand aside. Melancholy's smile did not diminish. Still, I must ask the riddle. It is the nature of the mask. I am afraid that Heather is a student of literature, said Sevens. She knows all your riddles. Do I? I snapped, losing control at last. Then I hiccuped, loud and awkward. Do I really? And you? I blazed at the Sphinx. What are you going to do if I answer incorrectly? I've escaped the jaws of much larger creatures than you. I can melt your digestive system if you even try. Then so be it. I will melt. We do not have time for this silliness, Seven said, with a tone that would have sent me into stuttering apologies if she'd turned it my way. Heather is exhausted and hungry and has already secured an audience with father. Stand aside, sister. No exceptions, Mel growled. And you cannot help her. No hints, or I will change the riddle to a harder one. Try me, I huffed. Sevens turned to me, an ice-cold severity in her eyes. Do not answer. Whatever she asks, it is not your responsibility. Are you ready, hybrid? Mel purred, patting another few steps forward, closing the gap to arm's reach. My heart tried to escape through the front of my ribs. Try as I might to restrain them, my tentacles whirled back up into a defensive posture, a ring of muscled threat ready to whip and punch and lash. Mel eyed them carefully and stopped her advance. Greater warriors than you have fallen beneath my claws. I snorted out a laugh, almost hysterical, at my wit's end. I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm not a warrior. I'm a university student. Students today are truly impressive, Mel purred, raising an eyebrow at my tentacles. Ready or not, here I come. Do not answer, Sevens repeated, cold and hard. It took an effort of will not to meet her eyes. She must, Mel purred. A wrong answer will bind you. Do not. Nothing can bind me that I do not choose, I murmured. Ask your riddle, Sphinx. If I get it wrong, I will be the one eating you. My words came out calm only because I was beyond tired, beyond caring, but also a little curious. Melancholy settled back on her leonine haunches, watching me with deceptively sleepy eyes. In that moment of stillness she looked like a statue carved from yellow sandstone. When she spoke, it was with lyrical rhythm, soft and slow, an assassin's dagger of oiled silver drawn from a scabbard of human leather. Each syllable lingered in the milky, pale air. Begun together, but forever parted. The same in form, but not inside. Mistaken for one alone, sometimes for mischief, but never for another. What am I? I couldn't believe my ears. Why would you ask me that? Melancholy just stared, heavy-lidded and inscrutable. Do not answer, said Sevens. You do not have. I know the answer, I snapped, unsure if I should feel humiliated or furious. You have heard this one before. Melancholy purred, making no effort to feign surprise. I sighed. Of course not, I suspect you made it up on the spot. But it's obvious. Why ask me that? What is your answer? I glanced at Sevens, she was watching me. Her intense, unreadable expression showed a tiny flaw, a faint tightness around her wide and staring eyes. This riddle was written for me, but we both knew it was aimed at her. What if I refused to answer? I asked. Mel rumbled. Then you may not proceed. What if I say I'm willing to fight you instead of answering? Mel tilted her head, the exact gesture of a cat considering a particularly stupid dog. Then perhaps you do love 7 shades of sunlight, but in the wrong way. And for that I will eat you, bones and brain and all, correct answer or not. Guilt stirred in my chest. Tenebrous melancholy of the umbral sands was correct. Love without respect was not love at all. But I didn't want to hurt sevens. And I didn't know what that desire implied. Your answer? Mel prompted. Twins, I surrendered. The answer to your riddle is twins. Sevens tightened her grip on my hand. Melancholy did not react, staring down at me from 10 feet up with all the languid illusion of a predator at rest. But I didn't raise my tentacles, I didn't tense up, I didn't even hiccup. Correct, Melancholy purred. Of course it's correct. I snapped. Of course I would know that answer. As if I'm not consumed by it every day. In everything I do for the last 10 years there has been a gaping hole, an absence, a missing presence by my side. And maybe that makes me not an ordinary twin at all, maybe I'm unhealthy and obsessed with her, but I don't care about that. It doesn't matter how happy I can feel in the moment or how many friends I make or how many people sleep in my bed with me. She is not here. Of course I know what you're talking about, and it is a cruel trick to use that fact in this way. You are a horrid thing. See, sister? Melancholy asked. She loves another. True guilt spread through my chest and belly like a web of rot. I'd forgotten how the Yellow King's progeny made everything into a performance, made every emotional point with endless theatrics, and knew everything they required about the subjects of their plays. Melancholy had made a good point, I was using sevens. Not just right now to help me deal with this emergency, to help me reach her father and get home, but ultimately to help me rescue Maisie. The same way I was using everyone else in my life. It was true. I loved another, and I would do anything to get her back. Even exploit the love of an outsider godling daughter. I turned my eyes away, staring down at the rose-pink bricks and the pale grass beyond the road. Dry words stuck in my throat. I wanted to hide inside my squid skull mask again. My tentacles bunched around my torso in a protective ball and I moved to slip my hand out of Seven's grip. I didn't deserve what she was offering, I didn't deserve any of this, I was using her, lying to her, manipulating her. But she tightened her grip again. No, I murmured. Sevens, no, I am enlightened, sister, Seven said, cool and calm, her words cutting through my guilt like a red-hot scalpel, cauterizing healthy flesh to burn out infection. Melancholy purred. I have been enlightened as to why you remain in that form after so many years. If you donned a mask which required clothing, you would struggle to dress yourself in the morning, for you are so very stupid. Sevens. I squeaked. She isn't wrong, she. All relationships contain a transactional element, Sevens continued smoothly. The existence of the transaction itself is not a negative, or a corruption of pure intent, or a flaw in a perfect diamond. It is a prerequisite. Only the content of the transaction can be negative. Observe. She turned to me. Heather, may I kiss you? What? My mouth fell open. I glanced at her lips, soft and pink and stern. Now. Here. Here and now. I started to blush. Sevens, I. It is not necessary, but we both desire it. She turned back to Melancholy. I wish to claim her lips and feel them against mine. She wishes the same toward me. We make a transaction of pleasure, and further enjoy the pleasure inflicted upon each other. Inflicted? I whined. This principle is fractally nested and can be applied at any level. But it is not equal, it can never be equal. I would enjoy the kiss more than her, Sevens explained to Melancholy. Love is not rainbows and fairy tale endings, sister. It is messy and hard work, constant and unrelenting. The rescue of her sister will bring her joy, which will bring me joy. And she will benefit more than I, and that I accept. That is love, sister. Melancholy's human face twisted with slow disgust, tail swishing, claws flexing. She even began to show her teeth in a silent snarl. Sevens drove home the knife, only a romantic fool convinces themselves otherwise. A dreamer who ends up pining for something which they imagined as pure, but was only pure because it was stillborn, never tested, never admitted. It was not real. It was real. Melancholy bellowed. I flinched. Sevens did not. Then why do you wear her face? Sevens asked. When you could wear the one with which you loved her. Melancholy huffed through her nose and rose from her haunches, sliding her massive claws out from between the furry toes of her paws. For a second I was terrified we had provoked a fight, but she tossed her head and slid the claws away again, then padded over toward Saldy's sphere machine. The riddle is answered, your way is clear. When you see father, tell him he is a horse-pox-ridden slit. Sevens and I shared a glance. I let out a shuddering breath as the tension left me. She shrugged minutely. Thank you, I whispered. Anything for you, Sevens murmured, for my ears alone. But this one may not proceed, Melancholy growled, sniffing the blocks of the gray sphere machine, a dark frown on her face. Hiding in a shell, pretending to be a ball of stone. My nose is not so easily led astray. I was not sent for you, but you have irritated me. You must answer a riddle too, whatever manner of soft meat lies within. She sat back on her haunches, adopting a haughty and unimpressed expression. Open up, coward. To absolutely nobody's surprise, Saldy's did not open up, but I gasped in shock when her sphere machine began to roll forward, the gray blocks clicking against the surface of the rose brick road, heading straight for the Sphinx as if to brush her aside. Tenebrous Melancholy of the umbral sands let out a lion's roar. She launched herself at the gray sphere, battering it with hammer blows from her paws, raking at it with claws as long as knives. The sphere stopped, but nothing could penetrate the imperishable material. Saldy's shell was far too well made to be breached by a cat, no matter how big. The Sphinx landed a dozen more blows, then rocked back on her paws to catch her breath. The sphere moved forward again, but Mel threw herself at it with renewed frenzy, stopping it in its tracks. I may not be able to rend you limb from limb, Melancholy growled, but you may not pass without a correct answer, snail thing. Sevens bent down to my ear, her ruler-straight blonde hair brushing my cheek, and whispered, let's carry on. Leave them to their fun. But, Saldy's. Saldy's tried to inch forward again. Mel threw herself at the sphere, slashing and slamming. She couldn't actually stop it from moving, but Saldy's seemed unwilling to run her down or ram into her. Like this, it would take days for Saldy's to inch to the open invitation of the palace doors, still a half-mile's walk further down the rose brick road. Better she doesn't come with us, Sevens whispered. After all, don't you want to visit my room? Just the two of us. I went wide-eyed at 7 shades of seriously seductive, my cheeks flushing bright red, my palms suddenly clammy in her hand. Her wide, staring, intense eyes were unreadable as she looked down at me, just that tiny bit taller than myself. "Why? You can sit down and rest before your audience with my father. Have something to eat. Nap. I'll keep you company, kitten." I very nearly left Saldy's behind. Can you blame me? I wouldn't have blamed me. I'd have given myself a pat on the back. Suddenly, a little black dot came scurrying over the pale grass beyond the rose brick road. It seemed to have come from nowhere, burst from some hole hidden by an invisible fold in the flat landscape. Before anybody could react, it shot across the ground and onto the surface of the road, right beneath Melancholy's whirling paws. Kya, the Sphinx let out a shriek, a cartoon scream completely unsuited for her predatory elegance and power. Yellow eyes gone wide, she backpedaled away from the gray sphere, paws flailing in the air with the ungainly comedy of a cat with all grace discarded. She fell onto her side and scrambled back to her feet, wings flapping uselessly, hissing and spitting at a rat. A sleek, fat, black rat, up on his hind legs in the middle of the road, staring down a sphinx hundreds of times his own size. Coward! Melancholy bellowed again. You! The rat scurried at her a second time, looping around her feet and past her rump, unafraid of the weight of her paws as she danced on the spot as if suddenly standing on hot coals. She yowled and screamed and backed away again, fleeing from the rat in cringing disgust. But he followed, forcing her back with nothing except paradoxical fear. Oh my goodness, oh! I blurted out, struggling not to laugh as I raised a hand to cover my mouth. It was horrifying. Melancholy could have crushed the poor rat to paste if she tried, but seeing such a massive, dignified feline act like a spooked kitten was too much. Salty's gray sphere machine suddenly blossomed open down the front. She came out laughing too, leaning through the opening with one foot up on the lip of the machine, her other two rats perched on her shoulders. That's right, Motsogner, she cheered through her laughter. Give her the ol' 1-2 knockout. For a split second, Melancholy's yellow eyes blazed past her tiny opponent to fix Salty's with a look of impotent rage. Her whole body tensed, wings cracking the air, ready to pounce with her powerful back legs, but then Motsogner the rat leapt at her face and she yowled, scrambling back on skidding paws. A strong hand caught the rat mid-leap. No more Sphinx. No more 10-foot monster born from earthly myth. In her place stood a woman, undoubtedly human, with dark skin and darker hair in long messy curls, dressed in sandals and sun-bleached, loose-fitting robes over mismatched pieces of bronze armor, which left her muscled arms exposed. She wore a sword on a belt around her waist, in a scuffed, unadorned scabbard. Past middle age, her face was lined by care and weather, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent and very yellow. She scowled at Motsogner as she held the rat at arm's length. Motsogner twisted and turned, but Melancholy's new mask had him firmly by the scuff of his neck. I wouldn't suggest irritating him, Salty's called out, gently mocking as she struggled not to smile too hard. He can be most vicious when roused. Lips pursed, with a scowl of such thunder it could have given Evelyn a run for her money, Melancholy marched up to Salty's and held out the rat. Your property, I believe, she said, in an accent I'd never heard before, an accent that probably didn't exist anymore, of lilting vowels and sharp consonants. Why thank you, Lady of the Sands, Salty's said, grinning wide. She accepted Motsogner back and cradled him against her chest. The rat looked particularly pleased with himself. Melancholy did not. She put her hands on her hips as Salty said, and with this demonstration, I take it there's no need for further riddles. I always hated the damn things, Melancholy answered, tight and hard, with an expression like she wanted to punch Salty square in the face. I blurted out. I'm sorry for laughing. I couldn't help it. Melancholy waved me away with an irritated flick of one calloused hand, not even bothering to meet my eyes. I laughed at her enough in life. It is good to see you being honest again, sister, Seven spoke up. TCH. Melancholy snorted. Apparently this new mask was not one for banter. She turned away, showing us a cold shoulder as she stalked past Salty's machine in the forest night, his weapon now slung over his shoulder again. She headed up the rose brick road, away from the palace, leaving us behind. She threw words back over her shoulder, I hope you find what you're looking for, Seven Shades, but I'm afraid you're staring into an empty grave. Where will I find father? Sevens called after her, soft yet sharp. At the center of the party, she shot over her shoulder without turning back, sandals slapping on the rose brick road. Where else? We watched her leave, rolling her shoulders to pull her robes tighter, until she dwindled to a figure trudging across the pale landscape, half lost in the milky mist. What a delightful woman, Salty sighed with genuine admiration. I would like to meet her again, though not when she's barring my way. Is she going to the library? I asked Sevens. Sevens shrugged delicately. Unlikely. She looked at me, a lingering and meaningful look with those intense eyes. Shall we? Quite. Saldi said, settling back into her seat. Not you, Seven said to her. Be quiet. Nothing now stood between us and the palace gatehouse except half a mile of rose brick road across the pale plain. A pair of huge wooden doors waited, wide open, large enough to admit the Sphinx herself with double the room to spare. I nodded, gathering myself as best I could and matching Seven's step as we walked on. The palace loomed over us as we drew closer, but I tried not to look up. The way it was piled up on itself in endless layers drew the eye inward in a dizzying spiral, as if looking down into a pit without a bottom. The forest night marched behind us without a care. Salties trundled along at our rear, chattering nonsense about the Sphinx and other half-animals, but I wasn't listening. I was trying to focus on what I was going to say to the Yellow King if indeed he decided to adopt a form that would listen to me at all. My guts churned and my head swam with growing nerves. Without the fearful distractions of giant lions or screaming geometry, I stared ahead, past the palace doors. A massive corridor was visible beyond, but it seemed to shrink tight after only a little way, perhaps 100 meters. Then it stretched and kinked and turned at angles which made my eyes itch, even at this distance. As we drew close, I caught snatches of laughter and little snippets of piano music on the air, barely on the edge of hearing. Sevens. Why can I hear a party? I asked. There's always a party, Seven said, with an unmistakable hint of disapproval in her already cold tone. Some best not attended. I adore a good party. Saldes announced. She even sniffed the air, though I could smell nothing beyond the grass and the mist. Good ale and roast meat, my favorite. As long as there's plenty to go around. As we approached the threshold of the palace doors, the corridor inside twisted as if seen through a funhouse mirror. With shaking hands I jammed my squid skull mask on over my head, taking refuge behind the eye holes. And then, beneath the snatches of music and laughter, a distant, stone-muffled scream drifted through the air. Yes, Sevens added on the last step as the palace loomed over us, we would do well to avoid this party.